Okay, so we have now the passage that is Homeric, that is about, was originally about Hermes as the psychopomp, right? The guy who leads the souls of the dead in their journey to the afterlife. And it's being applied here to Yaldabaoth, right? The serpentine slash lion-headed or roost-headed in various incarnations, more typically lion-headed, demiurge or creator god of the material world, according to the Gnostics like the Naassenes, as well as the Sethian Gnostics and others. Okay, so and this is appropriate because the caduceus, the so-called caduceus by the Romans, or the kerekion, the like messenger staff of Hermes, involves two intertwined snakes, as you see here in that, I think, 5th century BC um, metallic depiction. So that's why there's a connection between the serpentine demiurge of the Gnostics and Hermes as the logos bearer, right, the interpreter and messenger of the Olympian gods of old. So this is part of the whole situation with the Nicene Gnostics, right? Is that according to St Hippolytus in the Refutation of All Heresies, they would take, specifically the Naassene sect, would take Homeric passages and generally poets of polytheist antiquity and give them like neo-biblical spins. Okay, so without further ado, we shall translate the passage at hand. Okay, so holding the rod or staff that is beautiful in his hands, it is golden, the rod. He bewitches or like entrances magically the eyes of men, and he raises them from their slumber because they are asleep. They say that this one, this male character, is the only one who has power over life and over death. For they say concerning him that it is written, you shepherd them with a rabdos, a rod, the same word, rod or staff of iron. That is a quote from the book of Psalms. I think it's Psalm 2 or 3, one of those two. And they say that the poet, that is Homer, sought to adorn, cosmically adorn, that which is inconceivable, namely the blessed nature of the Logos, not with iron, but rather with gold. Such was the rod or rabdos rendered. So Saint Hippolytus is simply saying that like they combine the psalmic passage about the rod that shatters the ceramics that is ascribed to the Messiah in that psalmic line. They claim that the Homeric line about Hermes, the golden rod, is simply the poet Homer like making this rod of the Logos character more fancy by making it gold rather than iron in the biblical passage. Which, I mean, it's a bit of a stretch. The only thing in common that these passages have is the rhabdos, right? The material is different. But that just goes to show you the kind of syncretism that these Naascenes were engaging in, right? Taking random Homeric lines and connecting them to random Psalmic lines in order to make their random case. It's pretty like wild exegesis. Mind you, though, even in Orthodox exegesis, you can get some pretty amazing mental gymnastics. I mean, I'm not personally bothered by mental gymnastics. I know modern people are, but if you're bothered by that sort of thing, antiquity probably isn't for you generally, and ancient religions, because there's a lot of fluidity and mental gymnastics involved in cobbling things together and interpreting things. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, per se. At any rate, so carrying on now, he bewitches the eyes of the dead, they say, for he raises them from their slumber, and these who are awoken from sleep, they become mnesteras, that is to say, they become uh, suitors, right? Like the same word is used of the suitors of Penelope in the Odyssey. But it's also, as I said before, Nestor can also be used of like the betrothed, like Saint Joseph in his caring for the Virgin Mary and so on. At any rate, that's again this bridal language. Like if we recall the pastas, the bridal chamber, there's a whole connection between the afterlife and creation and, the marriage chamber and weddings and coitus and so on. Like this is a thing in ancient religions generally. It makes sense, right? Because what are the intense elements of human existence, right? Its beginnings in coition and its ending in death. And they're kind of related, right? Because you beget people through coition, you bring them into generation, and all generated things are inherently mortal, and thus they die, right? So it makes sense. All this stuff, love and marriage and death are all pretty interwoven, aren't they, in our human existence? And that's, a focal consideration of religions generally. Okay, so returning to the text, they say concerning these things that the scripture says, arise, O slumbering one, and wake up, for Christ has shone forth unto you. And that is a quote from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. As a side note, like St. Jerome in his Latin commentary thereon he says, and I paraphrase, something like, oh, there are people out there that say that this is taken from some apocryphal text by St. Paul. I, for one, in my readings of the Hebrew writings, have not found such a text. But you get other characters like St. Epiphanius of Salamis, and you also get George Syncellus in his Chronicle, who mentioned that this quote is taken from like an extra biblical Old Testamentish text. It makes sense. It so looks like a quote to me. But whatever. At any rate, it's most famous for occurring in Ephesians, and that's where these guys are presumably getting it from. So returning to the text, and this Christ, they say, is in all of the generated things the Son of Man, who is characterized. What that literally means is something like embossed or depicted, is like the embossed or depicted form of the non-embossed or non-depicted logos. So that's quite significant that Christ is the Son of Man in the Gnostic understanding is like the imprinted, made, like artistically rendered, visible form of the invisible logos. Now that's not that unrelated to like Orthodox language. You'll get characters like Saint Basil in adopting Timaean slash Platonic language, talking about this sort of thing of like the logos as the image of the Father who is not depicted. That's not like an inherently wrong conception theologically, even from an Orthodox standpoint. Um, there is sometimes commonality and crossover between the Gnostics and the Orthodox fathers in their exposition of the Bible through Platonic language, right? Okay, so this thing they say uh, is a great and ineffable mystery of the. Looking now at the bolded line here in the text and just quickly recapping. So this is a passage in St. Hippolytus's Refutation of All Heresies, wherein he's claimed that Homer's depiction of Hermes, the so-called messenger god, or in this case, psychopomp, that is guide of the souls of the dead, the psyche of the departed, using his serpentine interwoven rod or staff, the caduceus in Roman terms, kerukion in Greek terms, the herald's stick or rod, from the word kerux, meaning herald. We have here the Gnostic sect of the Naassenes, derived from the Hebrew term nachash, serpent, interpreting that Homeric depiction of this polytheist deity of old in terms of the logos in Christian terms and the messianic figure of Psalm 2 in the Hebrew Bible who has a rod of iron. Here, the Homeric rod of Hermes, the logos, is gold, and the Gnostics reconciled that by simply claiming that Homer was giving a metal more appropriate to the logos by selecting gold rather than the biblical poet David and prophet using iron. But at any rate, there's this amalgamation of the Hebrew Bible messianic logos and the logos Hermes, who's the guide of the soul of the dead. And there's a correlation between Christ as the one in St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians who raises up the dead from sleep, and Hermes, the one who with his rod raises up the souls of the dead and guides them in the afterlife. Okay, so that's the background of this entire passage. And then in the bolded line, this is what's of interest, really, as far as the Eleusinian mysteries are concerned, is St. Hippolytus says this, and they say, that is the Naassene Gnostic sect, that this is the great and ineffable mystery of the Eleusinians, and then quote, Hue Kue, right? Or in later pronunciation, late antique pronunciation, and modern pronunciation, Ie Kie. So what is that? So that is two imperative commands, namely reign and conceive. So the claim made by St. Hippolytus in reporting the beliefs of the Naassene Gnostic sect, who have derived their cosmology from Homer and from the, as in the great bard of old, the poet, but also from the mystery cults, in this case specifically the Eleusinian mysteries. The whole essence of that mystery cult is expressed in this kind of mantra, this apparent ritual promulgation that was used in the Eleusinian mysteries. And it consists of two imperatives, namely the command to reign and to conceive. So presumably there's a direct address of the sky to reign and a direct address of the earth to conceive as a result of that reign. And obviously, when we look at that, male female dynamic of heaven, Uranus reigning, and Gaia conceiving, it's rather marital, right? It's coition. So, in other words, the mystery cult is centered on the interpretation of the natural phenomenon that brings about fecundity of the earth and agriculture. Our crops grow because of the rain that cometh down. The rain that cometh down is akin to mechanically a man's emission of seed, and the earth's gestation or birthing of fruits, of grains, and so on, is likened to the way a woman becomes pregnant when she receives the male input. We can think too of the idea of the pattern and matter, right? So the pattern, the blueprint, the conceptual design is male, right? Pattern is etymologically connected to pater, father, and matter, the stuff acted upon by the pattern and shaped by it, is related to mater, right? Mater, mother, right? There's again a male female dynamic there that's fleshed out, particularly, pardon the pun, in the Timaeus of Plato, for instance, in its first kind of grand articulation. There are many articulations henceforward. But this idea, this just simple idea of make it rain, right? Of the rain bringing about the fecundity of the earth, and that being akin to human gestation and life. It's really what is at the crux of the Eleusinian mysteries, according to St. Hippolytus's presentation of the beliefs of the Naassenes as derived from the Eleusinian mysteries, wherein he quotes this little ritual formula, this mantra of hue kue, right? Reign and conceive. Now, this is recorded nowhere else. This phrase, this mantra of the Eleusinian mysteries, but that is not necessarily a reason to dismiss it or doubt it. It totally makes sense in the context that such a ritual promulgation would be at the heart of the Eleusinian mysteries. And even if the dynamic of reign and gestation and an analogism between human coition and the fecundity of the cosmos, whereby the heavens rain down, animating juice, the rain, and the earth consequently gestates and births, some might consider that unimpressive or not particularly deep or whatever, but that's not really, that arbitrary modern aesthetic presumption is not really particularly significant, right? In actuality, this dynamic is something that lies at the heart of the archaic conception of fecundity of microcosmic man and the wider macrocosm, the crops and fruits of the earth and the crops and fruits of the human body and soul, namely the children that arise from coition. Perhaps in the contraceptive era of modernity, this is no longer viewed positively, no longer like reverently engaged in, but it was certainly a big thing in the pre-modern world. So, just as a comparandum for this dynamic of the divine sky inseminating the divine earth with the rain, it might be useful to turn to a passage, a brief fragment from Aeschylus, from a lost play, that is preserved in Book 13 of Athanasius's Diapnosophistae, Dinner Sophists, which is a real, like a late antique text that preserves many interesting fragments from many earlier authors. Even though it's primarily talk about food and to some extent about harlotry, there's lots of cool data in this text. Okay, so in this particular passage, we have Myrtilus, who's a grammarian from Thessaly, and he is quoting from various poets, various composers of old, to support his case that Eros and Aphrodite, the love divinities, the erotic divinities, are incredibly powerful and have a huge influence over the cosmos. And so he quotes this passage from Aeschylus to support his case. And the reason we're looking at it, right, is it really fleshes out well this idea of the hue kue, right, the reign and conceive dynamic. Okay, so the mapping of human marriage and coition onto the marriage and coition between sky and earth that produces fecundity, fruits, fruitfulness, food, life, right? So I'll translate here using my laser pointer. Aeschylus has Aphrodite is the one speaking in the play at this point, and this is from a lost play that was part of the um, broader tetralogy dealing with the the daughters of Danaus, the Danaids. Okay, so pure Hagnos, pure Uranos, pure heaven, erotically desires to wound earth. Now, in saying wound, like um, sorry to be crude, but it's up, you can think of it in terms of like create a gash, so to speak. And, if you use your noggin, given the erotic context, you can work out what that might mean. Okay, so Eros receives Gaia, Earth with the capital E, right? Lady Gaia, to chance upon marriage, gamos. Now, keep in mind marriage, gamos, and the associated verb. Um, in the archaic context, to marry and to copulate are not really separate events and separate words. It's really one and the same because it's the act of coition that really is marriage. Hence why there's this notion of, in olden time speech of like the consecration of a marriage and the idea that if you haven't performed coitus yet, like you're not really married. So if you're betrothed in the ancient pre-modern conception, I should say pre-modern because it's not that old, right? It was, if you just go a couple grandmas back, this is how it was. Um, the idea is that if you haven't actually done the deed yet, you're not really married. Even if you're betrothed, but you haven't done the deed, it can easily be cancelled, called off, and no one's at a loss because in this conception, because you're not really in gamos yet. But once the gamos is there, regardless of arrangements or agreements or contracts or rights, like it's on, right? The union has happened. And maybe that's alien to modern people, but it's pretty mechanically sensible when you think about it, the conception. At any rate, so all that's simply being said here is that pure heaven uh, desires to make a split in the chthon, the earth, right? That's where we get chthonic from, and autochthonous, right? Just another word for the earth divinity, who is female, and the heaven divinity is obviously male in the Greek conception. And so it's Eros, the divinity Eros, who kind of acts as an intermediary who brings Gaia as bride to Uranus, if you will. He's kind of the one hovering between heaven and earth and facilitating their union. And so now we get ombros. So ombros is the word for rain in ancient Greek, one of the words. And obviously we get the word umbrella, right? Umbrella from that same etymological root. So rain falls or is falling from the um, well flowing heaven and makes Gaia conceive, become pregnant, gestate. And that is the same verb there, ekuse, as the imperative kue in the ritual formula, hue kue, right? Reign and conceive. Ombros is one of the words for rain. Huetos is another word for rain that gives us the hue vocative. Okay. And the this is interesting. So there is a like an ambiguous phrase here, melon boscas can mean one of two things. Keep in mind the way the accentuation is produced in this edition before us is to some degree like a product of Hellenistic scholarship and modern conceptions. Um, in the original like Aeschylean text, it would have been hard to differentiate the word mela with a circumflex from the word mela without a circumflex. And the difference is one word means like melons in the sense of fruits. The other means flocks of sheep. And the word boskas is like um, comes from a verb to like pasture for animals to eat, right? But so it can either mean like the shepherding of flocks, or it can mean like the food stuff of fruit. And I think the ambiguous phraseology is deliberate because in this passive construction, it is said that the pasturing of flocks slash fruit is birthed unto mortals as a result of the aforementioned union. And I think the idea is that it's both fruit and also like pasturing animals. Both of those are dependent on the raining upon the earth. And both of those are expressed in that ambivalent phrase, that phrase that has two meanings. Okay. So melon boscas, and then the Bion Demetrion, right? The Demetrian life. So the idea being the life of Demeter or Demeter, right? The female goddess who presides over agriculture and the mother of Kore, the maiden, Persephone, who's at the heart of the Eleusinian rites. Okay. And then the Dendrotis Hora, right? The season of trees. Um, is perfect, is teleos, is consummate, we could say, to encapsulate the kind of underlying sexual overtones, is consummate, is rendered perfect from this moist gamos, this moist or moistening marriage or coition. Notisdo means to moisten. And I mean, you can think of, yeah, the rain upon the earth, and you can think of the human equivalent. And then Aphrodite concludes by saying, Tondego paraitios, right? I am the one who is the cause of these things. So Aphrodite is speaking, and she depicts herself as the cosmic force that brings it about through her intermediary underling Eros, the union of heaven and earth that produces fecundity in fruits and animals that help humans live the Demetrian agricultural life. Okay. Now, there is a variant reading of the manuscript. Instead of Dendrotis hora, right, the tree season, the treely season, instead you can have Dendron te oporan, the fruits of the trees, which, that could be a more sound reading. I'm not particularly fussed about that. And you can also read a bit differently. Instead of Telios esti, the is perfect, um, in reference to the season, right? So I should specify that in translating that it's the dendrot on this reading of the manuscript, it's the tree season that is perfect or consummate as a result of the moistening marriage. But you can read it otherwise and have it as from this moistening marriage, all the things that are perfected. And then it ends with the same thing of Aphrodite saying, and I'm the cause of these things. The meaning doesn't really change. It just goes to show you that you can construct the text a little bit differently. Now, a concluding remark or helpful comparandum, I should say, from from all the way from India, from the Vedic corpus, is this little quote here from the Atharva Veda. So before I translate that little Sanskrit line there on the bottom, I might as well just procure this cool image of a ritual that occurs in some parts of rural India, towards the north, Assam, as well as a bit further inwards, where there's this like folk custom of securing monsoon rains by marrying two frogs in a certain ritual. And I just think they look stunning. I mean, who is not impressed by that right there? I mean, that's deeply moving to me, and I'm sure it is to you. Um, so let's look at this passage here, and let's give it a translation. So, I am he, and the he here is the Mahapurusha, presumably. So the speaker, this is like a mantra that is used in the actual marriage ceremony. And so the husband over here declares that I am he, capital H, I am the Mahapurusha, right? From the Mahapurusha Sushupta, the like hymn to the great consciousness, the great man. Um, so in other words, the male human is like a microcosmic equivalent of the macrocosmic masculine godhead. And Satvam, right? You are her. Okay. Um, and so you're like the female equivalent or female half of the cosmic hermaphrodite, if you want to think of it that way. And then you have um Sama Aham, right? Condensed together. So I am an Asmi. I am the Sama, which is like where we get a certain portion of the Vedic scriptures that are songs. So I am capital S song, Sama. I am song. And Urktvom, you are Urkt, or like RK or RG, which is where we get like Rig Veda from. So Urk is like um Uruk is like a Sanskrit term meaning word or utterance. So I am the male song divinity, capital S. You are the female utterance, the Ruk. So Sama and Rik, or Rig, if you want to go with Rig Veda, however you want to transliterate that. So thus far, I am the Mahapurusha. I'm like the great man. You are the female equivalent. I am Sama. I am song. You are female utterance. And then there's Dyauraham, right? I am Dyaus, which is the like cognate of Zeus. But it's in this case it's more like Uranos, like heaven. I am the masculine heaven divinity. And then Prithivitvam, you are Lady Earth. You are Gaia in Sanskrit terms. And then Taviha Song Bhavava Prajama Jana Yavahai. All right. So, and this is here together. We shall be together and we shall like procure, generate offspring. Prajam, which is that word for offspring is like cognate directly with the Latinate term progeny, right? Because it's got the pra and the gen component. Okay. So what is the point of all this? In this ritual formula, you have the husband and the wife likening themselves to earth and heaven coming together to form one in their progeny. So the exact same dynamic that we found in the Aeschylean passage, and which the exact same dynamic which underlies our little line here, which is the great, the mega and areton and ineffable mysterion, mystery of the Eleusinians, namely the mantra Huer Kuer, right? Reign and conceive. So hopefully that's of interest to people, this dynamic of heaven and earth uniting through the emission of rain semen, and that being connected to the erotic coupling of humans in order to produce fruit of the womb. They say that all things are subjected to him, right? Christ the Logos. And this is the thing said, into all of the earth has their speech gone forth. Now, this is a quote from one of the Psalms, and this particular psalm, if you like look at it in its original whole context, it is about the stars of heaven, right, the celestial bodies, and how even though they are like soundless, they are voiceless, they nonetheless like produce speech that goeth forth into all of the world. And furthermore, there's reference of like the sun in his bridal chamber and so on. Remember, like there is in the Hebrew Bible solar imagery of the Messiah, right? Like you have famously in the book of Malachi, there is healing in the sun's wings, and the sun is kind of being identified as the Messiah there. And no doubt you could argue that in this psalmic passage, the same is occurring. The Son of Righteousness. Okay. Like sun is in with a UN, right? Helios of righteousness. Now, it's also interesting that in the church, the Orthodox churches like hymnography, that psalm about, this their sound hath gone forth is applied to the apostles, and as such, it's kind of calling the apostles stars. And of course, there are 12 of them. That's a zodiacally significant number. There's this idea that we humans in Orthodox Christianity, and indeed, no doubt, in the Gnostic cosmology, and even to some extent the the Platonic cosmology, we elect wise human beings get to like rise up to the station of stars, right? We replace the stars that have fallen down, which in the Orthodox Christian understanding involves like the demons, the fallen angels who lost their celestial station and became like falling stars, and we as the elect go and take their place in the divine council that is the astronomical clockwork of the universe. That's a thing, right? It's a bit different in the Gnostic and Platonic understandings and the Buddhist understandings, but it's not altogether that different typologically, let's say. Hermes brought forth this rhabdos, this staff or rod, and the like shivering souls followed him constantly. And this is conveyed through an icon, an image by the poet that is Homer, when he said that like bats in the deep, like abyss or lower part, inner part of a divine cave, they tremble and like screech and make noises and fly about, and they fall off like a large mass of a rock, and then they cling to each other. Okay, so that's a famous quote from Homer about the souls of the dead and the psychopomp Hermes taking these bat-like souls to the underworld cave where they like hang on a rock. Okay, and now we're going to get the Naassene like interpretation of that, and you see the painting here of Hermes with his caduceus, his snake staff, as the psychopomp, as the guardian of or the guide, I should say, of the dead souls that you see about him. Okay. So that is the Naascenes, call this rock that's in that Homeric line, which the bat souls cling to. They identify that rock with Adamas, right? The hermaphroditic logos. Not that different from the Orthodox conception of Christ as the rock, right? They say that this one, namely Adamas, is the cornerstone, which is a quote used of Christ, that is selected to, or that is generated to be the to the head corner, right? And the head, the kephale, that is what they understand to be the characteristic encephalus, right? The brain, in essence, from which every patria, every like a race gets characterized. So what does that mean? Well, pausing here, we need to understand that in like Hippocratic medicine, ancient Greek medicine, critically, sperma, the seed, the semen, right, was conceived of as coming from the myelus, like the brain matter, and going down the spine to the pelvis. That's really important. So the brain goo and semen were seen as like the same substance in the ancient medical conception, which probably sounds absurd to modern medicine, and I imagine it doesn't quite add up to the modern medical understanding. But there's something kind of, I don't know, like intuitively sensible about this, in the sense that, there is a sense in which when one emits seminal fluid, one kind of loses some brain matter, so to speak. I don't know if you relate to that. The ladies in the audience won't relate, but maybe if you're a male, you'll kind of understand. At any rate, but this idea of that which is like characterized, we have to understand that the word character in English from Greek karakter, right? Charakter. This word comes from the verb like charaso, which means like to like etch, to scratch into the surface, to emboss, something like that. Um, and so you give shape, like you depict. So there's this idea that the gooey brain matter, right, is like just formless goo. But when it descends as sperm and like starts gestating in the womb, it takes on shape plastically. It gains character by being like embossed in the woman's womb. having left that like as just merely like formless substance from the brain, right? That embryology and spermatology of Greek medicine underpins what we're talking about here. And indeed, this is a conception that is already found faintly in the Timaeus of Plato, but it really reaches its boiling point here in Gnostic cosmology as expounded by St Hippolytus. But the argument is that this stuff goes back to the mystic cults that inspired the early philosophers, because physiologia, right, like natural science and philosophical religious discourse were not separate in the ancient world. This is an important thing to remember. Okay. Okay, returning to the text now. So they say that Adamas was like identified with the foundations of Zion, and they say that speaking allegorically, the plasma of man, right? Again, this is that word like the plastic creation, the molded vessel of man. This is what they call it. That um, Ada that Adamas is ranked thus. And then there's a dot dot dot, there's a lacuna, there's a hole in the manuscript. But as Homer said, teeth or the enclosure of the teeth, this thing is the wall or like the bulwark in which the inner man, having fallen from thence, from the arcanthropus, right? The human capital H, the original anthropos, who is the arche, right? The ultimate principle or cosmic starting point above, namely Adamas, having been cut without hands, this being is brought down into the plasma, into the plastic creation of forgetfulness, of lethe, namely this thing of coic substance, of earthen substance, that is the clay vessel. So pausing there, what's going on? So weirdly, there's this appeal to the authority of Homer, and there's this mention of the teeth of as an enclosure of the divine part that is from the hermaphroditic logos Adamas above, the noetic proto-man, the arcanthropos, the man who is the arche, the principle, the starting point of all reality, right? And it gets entrapped in the enclosure of teeth. So what the heck is going on here? So what is being said is that our mouth, our clackers, our teeth, right, is an enclosure of like a divine soul from above in this earthen clay vessel that is plastically molded, right? So in the Gnostic conception of the Naassene sect, according to St Hippolytus here in the text of the Refutation of All Heresies, our body with our clacking teeth in Homeric fashion involves a soul like taken from above. Now, why he attributes this to Homer is a bit unclear to me. Homer doesn't really say this per se, but whatever. The Gnostics say that he does. That our soul is like entrapped in this entoothed mouth of ours from above and is trapped in this clay vessel. That's simply what's being said. And they say that the like shivering, screeching bat souls, right, that were mentioned in the earlier Homeric passage, they follow the Logos, who is identified with Hermes, right? Um, and as they like shiver and screech, uh, they begin, or rather, that is to say, they like are led by Hermes, who takes them to like paths that are wide, and this is to say that and paths that are not only wide but also like free of evils, and that's like a Homeric quotation there, and that is to say, they claim that he takes them to places that are eternal, that are totally liberated from all evil. Okay, so yeah, the idea is that Hermes as the Logos takes the souls of the dead out of this like clay vessel when we die, back to like a paradisical place wherein there is no suffering. And they say, where do they go? Well, it is something akin to the flowings of Oceanus and the rock of Leucas, which is a place, an island, Lefkada in modern Greek, Lucas, near the Ithaca of homeland of Odysseus, right? Um, and where there is the gates of the sun and the demos, the like the people of the dreams. So that is Homeric quotation. So the idea is that to go to the land of the dead, you have to cross Oceanus, which is the divine watery rim around the edge of the cosmos in the Homeric conception. And remember, Homer says that the deity Oceanus Okeanos, right, is the one from whom spills forth the genesis of the gods, right? The generation of all the divinities cometh from Oceanus, these primordial waters on the outskirts of the world. And it's beyond there that you reach the land of the dead. And it's there that you get the gates of the sun, because the sun goes to the end of the world, much like we saw in that Egyptian depiction of Nux. Remember her mouth at the edge of the known world. Interesting coincidence there with the teeth gate, incidentally, related to what we're talking about. Yeah, but also the in the Homeric conception, dreams come from the bronze gates of the underworld as well, which is on the periphery of the world, which is kind of a cool idea, right? That dreams come from the underworld, and it kind of makes sense, right? Because when we're asleep, we're kind of dead. That's why I like being asleep so much, lol. Um, at any rate, returning to the text. So, and they say that this one, namely Oceanus, is the genesis of the gods, just like I said, as well as the genesis, the generation of humans, and that he always twists and turns, into this backflow. So that's this idea that Oceanus, is like the watery rim on the cosmos, is a kind of Ouroboros, like a snake eating its own tail, like this ever flowing, ever backflowing, circulation type situation. Okay, and yeah, always going up and down this river on the circumference of the disk world. Okay, so return to the text, and they say that when Oceanus flows downwards, Genesis is of humans, whereas when it is upwards around the wall and the bulwark that is the rock of Lucas, Leucas, right? That is when it is Genesis of the gods. So that's kind of interesting, right? That pausing the text there, that in this Naassene Orphic conception, the Olympian gods are divine beings, right? And their souls come from Oceanus, the great river of the all-flowing universe. Going upwards, it makes God souls. When it goes downwards, it makes human souls. But it's this idea that we humans and the Olympians are of like the same stock in this Gnostic conception of the Naascenes. And this is closely related to the Greek Orphic mysteries, or just the mystery cults generally, because there is this idea therein that, like we see in the gold tablets of the Orphic cult, which identify humans as like uh, fallen divinities that are of both heavenly and terrestrial natures. Children, I am a child, a pice of both starry heaven and of earth, says the famous gold Orphic tablet. Right, this idea that the souls of humans were once also the souls of the gods, and we're in this like ever-flowing cycle of reincarnations whereby gods and humans like can change place. This Empedoclean and Orphic and later Gnostic conception is quite an important one that I don't hear people often talking about, but it can be found here in the text that I've mentioned, like the gold tablets and right here. It's quite a cool image. Um, all right, so return to the text, and they say that this thing is written, quote, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Now that is a famous quote of the Psalms that is quoted by Christ in the Gospel of John as well when he's discoursing with the Pharisees, and it's quite an awesome line, isn't it? Um, Now, in this Gnostic conception, under the influence of like the pagan mystery cults, it's taken to mean that there are some souls that are gods, like Olympian gods, and there are some souls that are humans that come from the same source and that are ever cycling and exchanging. Now, it's a bit different in the Orthodox Christian exegetical conception. It's typically seen as referring to the idea that the angels were the sons of gods, but the ones that sinned and became demons became like perishable and mortals and lost their status as like divine sons of the Most High, and instead became princes who shall die like humans, right? In other words, they shall be condemned to Tartarus and tortured eternally in the great death of deaths that is hell, right? Uh, because hell in the Christian conception, quoting Christ in the Gospels, is the eternal fire that is prepared for the devil and his angels, right? And it just so happens that the people who align themselves with those principalities shall share in the same perpetual eternal death, right? Is the conception. Um, and we too, though, as Adam, prelapsarian Adam, right? The image of God, coded in uncreated light, enrobed in it. We were, God-like beings originally, but we have come to, die in this world. So, I mean, there's differences and similarities in the Orthodox and Gnostic conceptions. In some ways, more similarities than differences at the typological level, but doctrinally and psychologically, the nature of the soul, the nature of the divine essence, that's where the crunch of the differences lie. Okay. Um, at any rate, so returning to the text, uh, and if you shall flee from Egypt, you shall rush forth and shall, arrive at the crossover of the Red Sea into the wilderness. That is to say, from this downward mixture, you shall go up towards the Jerusalem on high. That is the mother of all those who truly are living. But if you turn backwards and return into Egypt, that is to say, you shall go down into mixture, coitus and of the flesh, and then as people you shall die. So pausing there for commentary. So as I just said, right, the idea of like, the angelic beings, the fallen angels, who according to the Book of Enoch, right, became priapic when they desired the daughters of men, right? And the Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopian in Ge'ez, says that they became like their members became such like fleshy like those of donkeys, which is a quote that occurs in Ezekiel's treatment of Ohalabah, the harlot. Yeah, but the idea is that these noetic principalities become infleshed in so much as they get, you know, tumescence, they get erections, and they go down and copulate with human women, right? And then consequently become enmeshed in mortality as opposed to being like, immortal, divine-like beings. That kind of same dynamic is implicitly at play here in this scriptural exegesis, right? The idea is there is a heavenly Jerusalem, a noetic realm where pure divine beings reside in the Naassene Gnostic conception, and by extension in the understanding of the soul in the polytheist mystery cults. So that upper realm of purity is where the noetic divine beings dwell, but then they come down into generation through coition, through like sexual appetite, which gets you incarnated, and you no longer are a pure divine noetic being, but are an incarnated, groaning, suffering, mortal being of flesh that dies, unlike the deathless beings up in that upper ethereal realm of the noetic beings. This is pretty like basic religion 101, very common, in the polytheist religious conception, and to some degree also shared by Orthodox Christianity to some degree, in the sense that, the eschaton paradise and the original Eden is like a sexless place, whereas sex is associated with growth, but also with death and suffering. Okay. Um, and there's all this cosmological imagery of like fleeing Egypt, which is the land of darkness and corruption and death, and going to the promised land, the kingdom of heaven, right? Hence the Exodus imagery of crossing the sea and so on, and crossing the River Jordan when they get to the Holy Land in the book of Joshua and so on. It's given this kind of spiritual meaning of like the original celestial homeland of the soul versus this land of exile and sex and corruption, and then going back to the sexless realm. So for those who are very invested in sex, this afterlife, mustn't be very appealing. But for those of us who find it frightening, it's somewhat comforting. At any rate, so returning to the text, and they say that this mortal soul in its entirety, or rather, no, sorry, I stand corrected, that they say that this mortal death-bearing thneter, mortal genesis or generation, is all downward facing, yet the one which is generated upwards is immortal. Okay, so one is born from water alone and spirit from spirit. This one is spiritual and not sarkic or carnal, fleshy. Whereas the one who is downward facing, downward directed, is carnal. And they say that this is what is written, that the one born from the flesh is flesh, and the one born from the spirit is spirit. And I believe that's from the first letter to the Corinthians by St. Paul. And it's given this particular like incarnational meaning of the soul in the Naassene Gnostic belief. Keep in mind that Orthodox Christianity doesn't see the soul as pre-existing like the body. Okay, like there may be thinkers like Tertullian who are traducianists who kind of suggest such things, but he's not like considered particularly orthodox. Typically in normative Orthodox Christianity, the soul arises when the zygote arises, right? And they're kind of concomitant, right? There is no soul without body. They arise together, and when they arise, they're together until death, and their separation is considered a great lamentable, perverse tragedy, and they await reunification in the resurrection, the physical resurrection at the end of time, right? When the living and the dead are judged. Okay, but that is not the Gnostic conception or the polytheist mystery cult pagan conception. For them, the soul is eternally existent, and its incarnation in a body of flesh in the terrestrial realm is like the anomaly and the sickening happening, right? The poor, noble, pure soul from above, right, is bound up in a prison house of a body. Oh, yuck, right? That's very different to the Christian conception of like, no, we are inherently embodied beings. Our soul and body must be married, and it's their separation that's tragic. And yes, this life is hard, and we suffer and have bizarre sexual appetites and blah blah blah. But that's just a condition of being fallen. But if we're of the elect, if we are resurrected, and our soul and body is reunified after our death, we shall partake of a beautiful paradisical eschaton wherein we shall experience no such suffering and will come to understand just how beautiful it is to be an embodied soul when you're not subject to corruption and sin and death and pain and lust and so on. Okay, so I'm just explaining the difference between, the Gnostic and Orthodox conceptions, just so you understand in case you're not aware. Okay. Um, so carrying on with the translation. So this is the pneumatic or spiritual generation, according to them. They say that there is a great river Jordan who floweth downwards and who impedes the sons of Israel from coming out of Egypt. That is to say, coming out of the mixture that is below, right? The coition and intermixing of this down below world of generation, right? For they say that Egypt is the body, according to them. Okay. So they allegorize the soul as belonging in Upper Jerusalem, the Noetic Jerusalem of the above world, whereas the below world of Egypt is the body tomb in which we're caught up, entrapped as eternal souls yearning for our homeland, stuck in this body prison, which is inclined towards coition because sexing results in more people getting incarnated and dragged down out of the pure soul world into this prison house, this Egypt of slavery, right? Because Jerusalem is the land of freedom and light, Egypt is the land of slavery and darkness, and these Naassene Gnostics interpret that in terms of like a body-soul dichotomy. Pure soul land for the free souls, bad body house prison. This is very unorthodox and very Gnostic. This is People don't like that I use the term Gnostic and they say, oh, there are lots of different sects and they're very nuanced and very different. Yeah, I know that. I know that. But they are all alike in having this common fixation on the body soul dichotomy and this belief that the material world and the body are problematic, something which is not shared with the Orthodox strain of Christianity. That's the crux of the difference between the Gnostic sects, despite all their diverse texts and cosmologies. That is the key difference between them and the Orthodox Christians. And indeed also between the Orthodox Christians and the polytheist pagan mystery cults, because they too have reincarnation and this idea of the soul as purer than the body and entrapped in the body. This is a key difference. And for what it's worth, in my personal beliefs, like I don't like the Gnostic and polytheist conception of the body as a tomb for a pre-existing soul that is entrapped therein. I think when you start looking at the world like that, it doesn't embodied reality is no longer pleasant, and it seems hard to understand like what we're doing here, and it seems like if you want to be free from the body, like why wouldn't you just take matters into your own hand and set that soul free, so to speak? Obviously, I'm not endorsing that action, but such a cosmology to me makes one inclined to that. And you get the paradox of the fact that the Platonists and the polytheist mystery cults prohibited suicide, despite teaching this idea that the body is is a prison house for the soul. I suppose the idea is that they view prison super negatively, right? That's the saving grace of at least the Platonic conception, that at least in their understanding of the prison house, it's a place to be educated and illumined and to learn. So that's quite beautiful and positive. But the Gnostics don't really have that positive take that the Platonists had. And indeed, that is why there was um, a lack of agreement between the Gnostics and the Platonists. We should remember that Plotinus, the great Neoplatonist thinker, did not have nice things to say about the Gnostics. He was their enemy. And many modern people today like to conflate Gnosticism and Platonism, but Platonists didn't necessarily like Gnostics, and they, in my opinion, were far more noble than the Gnostics, who have, frankly, in my estimation, a rather sickeningly deranged cosmology, whereas the Platonists had a lot of beauty and truth in their worldview. Anyway, whatever, that's just my opinion. Getting back to the text. So, uh, Jesus sent and made them to flow upwards, right? The souls, that is. And they follow these, namely the ones who are like most brilliant and who are Gnostic, who are true knowers, and they are discoverers of a new art of grammar, of like, literary studies, for they take for themselves as a prophet Homer, who showed forth these things ineffably, like mystically, and they opine that the those who are like not initiated with respect to the Holy Scriptures, um, they bring their own thoughts to these texts and abuse them, and they say that the one who says that all these things were put together out of one is deceived, for he he says that it was out of three, and that it is true that um, concerning all things, one can give like a proof that they say there is one nature that is blessed of the blessed man above, namely Adamus. So then then there is one mortal nature that is down below. One nature is like without is a generation without king, the one begotten above, where they say Miriam was sought out, and a great wise man, Eothor, who is Jethro, in how he's typically rendered in English from the Hebrew, Jethro, and Sephora, who who looks about, and Moses, whose genesis was not in Egypt, for his children were begotten to him in Midian. That is to say, one should not forget the poets, for all things are divided in three, and each one received his honor. They say it is necessary to speak of the great magnitudes that are spoken of in this way by all, in various manners, so that those who might not might not understand, and those who see might not see. For, they say, if it were not said, the magnitudes of the cosmos would not be able to be composed. For there are three, um, like unbearably heavy or large logoi. And then we get these words in Greek that are transliterated from Hebrew. I'll render them into the like Erasmian reconstructed pronunciation, as well as like the later vernacular pronunciation. So kaulakau, saulasau, and zeasar, or zdeasar, or in later pronunciation, kavlakav, savlasav, and zeasar. Okay, so now I've bolded them. Obviously, this is like a weird Greekified Hebrew. We'll get to where in the Bible that comes from, and I'll explain like what it means after we finish translating this passage. So it's rather weird, right? Pausing thus far, what have we actually got in this passage? So we got the fact that among these Naassene Gnostics, there's like a dispute as to whether there is like one cosmogonic essence from which all things are composed, or whether there's three, and there's debate about that among them. And then in the context of this debate about like cosmogonic principles, they randomly, start talking about Miriam, presumably the sister of Moses, as well as Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, as well as Sephora, Moses' wife, and Moses himself, and the fact that his kids, um, one of his kids being Gershon was, which the name which means like a foreigner, was not born in Egypt, but was born in Midian. And remember, Egypt is like the body, so I think implicitly the Nassenes are like understanding him as like being a spiritual being, not incarnated originally, before getting like entrapped in Egypt, only to set the enslaved people in Egypt free and bring them out of Egypt, that is the body, in this Naassene Gnostic interpretation of Exodus, which is obviously very different to the Orthodox understanding of it. Um, but keep in mind, like the idea of this world as Egypt is something that occurs in the Apocalypse of John, the Revelation, the last book of the New Testament. So viewing like this world as like a fallen Egypt of darkness and slavery and death and plagues, and going out of this Egypt to get to the Jerusalem, is a theme in the Apocalypse of John and in Christianity, Orthodox Christianity as well. It just Orthodox Christianity doesn't have that body versus soul dynamic that defines Gnosticism. All right, but returning to the text. So Kaulakav or Kavlakav is concerning the above Adamas, whereas Saulasau or Savlasav is concerning the mortal of below, and then Zdeasar or Zeisar is it refers to the upwards flowing River Jordan. Keep in mind, really interesting, that the name Jordan, Yardan in Hebrew, like means to go down. Um, and it has like katabatic connotations, right? You go down into the underworld when you go down into this downflowing river, which is why Christ gets baptized in the River Jordan, the river downwards, because he goes down to the underworld to free the captives, the dead souls, and bring them up to heaven, right? Because the mystery rite of baptism involves going down into the River Jordan, the down river, down into death, to come back up and to truly live and to be resurrected through death, through life-giving death, right? That conquers death. Okay. Um, all right. So they say that this one is the anthropos, the man who is male, female, arsenothelus, hermaphroditic, in all things. But they who are ignorant, they call him the three-bodied Geriones, and they claim that this name Geriones comes from to flow out of the earth, because to flow out of the earth is ek ges reonta, right? And ek ges reonta, Geriones, right? You can see how through like folk etymology that can be understood, and thus the Hellenes, the pagan Greeks, commonly refer to the celestial horn of the man of the month of the moon, um, and they cry out these things to, or it rather, the horn of the moon, cry mixes up rather, kekerake mixes up all these things unto everyone, and yeah, another word to mix up, kata memike, so mixes up all these things to everyone. So pause there for a second. What is being said is that according to the Nicene Gnostics, Geryones, the tripartite, three-bodied being, is like a misnomer for Adamas, the Arsenothelus, the like hermaphroditic logos proto-man, the anthropos, the Jesus logos equivalent figure. They claim that the it St Hippolytus tells us that the Naassene Gnostics themselves emphasized the oneness of the monad of the hermaphroditic Adamas, but there were apparently people whom these Naassene Gnostics considered to be in error, so other Gnostics who had a wrong interpretation, who overemphasized the tripartite nature of the logos and had three archai, right? Three cosmogonic like principles or ultimate sources as opposed to one. So in other words, there's debate among the Naascenes as to whether it was Geryones, the three-part guy who floweth into earth, who's the ultimate source, or whether it's the singular hermaphrodite of the noetic sphere, namely Adamas, who's the ultimate source. But also keep in mind this etymological explanation of Geryones as to flow out of the earth. This relates, and this whole conception, right, of the soul that is above and that is noetic and pure being flowing downwards into the earth. Remember, in the Plutarchian passage that I assessed in another video, if you've seen that, you can go and see it if you haven't. There, Plutarch etymologizes Genesis as being flowing down, the roer, the flowing down into ger, into the earth. So this is something that the Gnostics were getting from already established polytheist mystery cult teachings. This idea that the soul flows down into the earth when it gets incarnated in the flesh. And that is how Genesis generation was understood by the polytheist mystery cults prior to the Gnostics, who got their conceptions from there. Okay. So, returning to the text, and they say that all these things through him were generated, and that without him, nothing that was generated, not a single thing like could be. That's of course like a quote from St. John's Gospel about the Logos, that all things were generated through the Logos at the beginning of the Gospel of John. And that which was generated in him is life. And they say that this life is ineffable and it is the generation of the perfect human beings, the teleoi anthropoi, and it was not known to former generations, for nothing which was begotten apart from him truly exists, for the cosmos is his. Now, before we move on, so I said I would explain what this Kaulakau Saulasau Zeisar thing is about, or Kavlakav Savlasav. So there is a line in Isaiah, the book of Isaiah 28, 10, 11, when it's read in the original Hebrew, that produces sounds that are very much similar to what we get transliterated in the Greek here, and I would say is the source for this bizarre tripartite division among the Gnostics. Now, this is really interesting because I've been emphasizing how St. Hippolytus is correct in saying that a lot of the content of the Gnostic cults, like the Naascenes and the Sethian Gnostics, comes from the pagan mystery cults. But that doesn't mean that there isn't also some actual genuinely rather, Hebraic material in the Gnostic cosmology. And this is a great example of that. These are bona fide Hebrew words, which means there were leaders among the Gnostics who were versed in Hebrew. Now, this is not that surprising. Something we forget, I think, in modernity, this is a bit of a rant, but it's important, we forget in modernity, is that in the time of Christ, Jews were converting Gentiles to Judaism. And they took that role very seriously. This is different to modern rabbinical Judaism that has no interest in making converts. It doesn't proselytize. But certainly we know Christ in the Gospel of Matthew, I believe it's Matthew, says that he says to the Pharisees, you rush to make proselytes of people and you make them double the sons of Gehenna than you are yourselves. Meaning to say, you make them all the more worthy of hell than you are when you convert them, because you convert them to a form of religion that's so bad that it leads to hell. But the point is, when he says that, he says you cross all the seas to do so. He's implying that there are diaspora Jews traveling far and wide to make converts in his time. We have no reason to doubt what he says. In fact, there are other historical sources that, and epigraphy and so on, that confirms that this was the case, because it was a thing. Many Gentiles would get circumcised and would join this cult, and as such would gain exposure to the language, because Hebrew is the liturgical language of Judaism. You can't really have much Judaism without Hebrew. At any rate, all that is simply to say that there were presumably Gnostics who were ethnically Hebrew or were Gentile converts to Judaism and as such learnt Hebrew, a mix thereof. And there's also the intermarriage thing, which is obviously has always been a thing. So that's just, indeed, I've heard it reported, I'm not a genetic expert, but I've heard it reported that many Ashkenazim, Germanic Jews and Slavic Jews have a lot of like Mediterranean Greco-Roman ancestry, which would make sense if in antiquity Greco-Roman people espoused Judaism and mixed into those populations and spread out into Western Europe. But, regardless, who knows? Who cares really? About genetics. It's not that important. I think language and culture is far more interesting. So these terms, we're going to look now at the Hebrew passage from the Masoretic recension of the Bible in the original Hebrew, and we're going to see how these bizarre terms used of the tripartite Geryones come from this interesting passage in Isaiah. Now, Isaiah 28 involves God addressing Ephraim, right? And the passage more broadly is about how they are drunkards and they are like rambling, manic, mantic folk who are like babbling their own prophecies. And yet, nonetheless, even though they're drunkards who are vomiting on their own dining tables due to excess and debauchery and are babbling forth like in the manner of pagans, nonetheless, God still speaks through them. That is what this passage is conveying. Okay, that's the context. So let's actually look at it. So it says, Ki tzav latzav, tzav latzav, kav lakav, kav lakav, ze'er sham. Okay, so that I did so that you get the onomatopoeia of how we got the kav lakav, sav lasav type stuff. Keep in mind that I said tzav, but that letter, there's no equivalent in Greek because there's no in ts in ancient Greek. There is in modern Greek, right? But that's under later influences from other languages and later linguistic changes. So what does this mean? So ki is according, and then sav is like a command or order. So according to an order, according to an order, according to an order. And then a measuring line, kav, is a measuring line, according to another measuring line, a kav, a measuring line. Uh, and then a little is zayer, and that's assumably where we get the zayasar over here in the Greek. So a little, and then sham is there. So what does that mean? So according to the commandment, to the commandment, to the commandment, the measuring line to the measuring line to the measuring line, a little here and a little there. Now, that's kind of babble, and that's kind of the point, okay? Because remember, here, the prophet Isaiah is imitating the speech of these babbling, drunk, like demonically possessed Ephraimites, and they're just making like cling clang noises, but in their like demon possessed, like mantic ramblings, they're making these cling clang noises, um, Tav latav latav, kav lakav lakav, zeyer sham. But this has meaning, even though it's babble. And the meaning is a commandment, a measuring line, a little here, a little there. Now, what is the actual meaning of that? Well, those who know like the literature of the Hebrew prophets generally will know that the measuring line is a huge symbol of like God's judgment. Like he goes and measures out Jerusalem before he brings about its destruction or before he constructs a new Jerusalem. It's this idea of I am the one who causeth you to die and to live. I am the one who establishes your city or tears it down, for I am the sovereign Lord. This whole rhetoric that's very common in the prophets when they're speaking, when the paraclete, when God is speaking through them. But here it's interesting because we're dealing with drunken degenerates who are babbling, and yet nonetheless their degenerate babblings and their cling clang sounds end up by chance, inverted commas, or by providential guidance, to sound like the judgment of God. And indeed, it is the judgment of God that Isaiah is promulgating against these drunkards. So he's saying, you're being measured up. God's come to you with his measuring line and with his divine commandment. And a little here, a little there, he's measuring up because he's going to tear you down because you are not complying with his divine ordinances, you drunkards, hearken, right? That's like the message. But the message is being conveyed through the babbles of the drunk people of Ephraim that is being judged, right? At any rate, and then you get this second line, and accordingly, be la'ageh, right, in the mocking safa, the mocking lip, uve lashon acheret, and in the foreign tongue, Yadaber El Ha'am Hazeh, right? The God, El, shall speak to this people. So that conveys what I just said, right? That in the mocking tongue and in in the mocking lip and in the foreign tongue, the Lord speaks to this people. So the people of Ephraim are being spoken to by God through the jocular, mocking lip and through the foreign tongue, the babble of the foreign prophets, this alien tongue, right? This non-godly mode of speech. Nonetheless, despite it being non-godly, mocking speech of drunkards, it actually is God Himself speaking to them and trying to warn them. So anyway, I just think it's really interesting that that particular very intense Hebraic passage that involves a lot of knowledge of Semitic languages somehow like crops up quoted here in the as in the tripartite division used by these Naassene Gnostic heretics to describe Geryones as the earthborn, like proto-human, as opposed to Adamas, the noetic hermaphrodite who is the Logos. It's fascinating because it just shows you the degree of like complex linguistic interculturation between Hebrews and Greeks and mystery cults and Hebrew prophets in the context that makes up Gnosticism. So it is a bit of an overstatement to simply say, the Gnostics just copy paste polytheist pagan materials. Because, yeah, they do that, but they also actually incorporate a lot of genuinely Hebraic material as well. And this is something that we forget about, just how intermeshed the Hebraic and um, Greek worlds were in antiquity. And I just think that potent linguistic evidence like this is quite interesting. But anyway, back to the text now. That was all, contextualizing on the side. So, apart from him was begotten by a third and by a fourth. They say that this is the cup that is called kondu, which is like kondu is like a drinking vessel, okay? In which the king doth drink, and he makes like omenistic promulgations. He reads omens. So pausing there, this is a reference to Joseph in Egypt when he becomes like Pharaoh or assistant to the Pharaoh. He can read he sees dreams and he can read omens in the cup that's used for prophesying. So, this is something that is forgotten in modernity, that in the world of the Bible, in the Bible itself, in addition to prophets like speaking through divine possession, you also have the idea of claromancy, reading, determining God's will through um, not rolling dice per se, but like drawing rods or things like this, using the bejeweled ephod breastplate of the priest, which glows to convey messages, but also things like reading in a cup of wine, which is a bit like how, in Balkan cultures today, you might, when you finish your coffee, you might overturn it and then look at the markings therein and determine your destiny, right? There is this tradition you might be exposed to if you happen to come from such a culture. The babushkas can be big on that, and the mothers indeed. Anyway, so that was a thing, even with the Reverend Prophet Joseph in the Bible. Okay, and that is what is being referred to here. And they say that this thing is hidden, and it is found in the nobles of Benjamin, in the noble spermata, in the noble semens and seeds of Benjamin. Remember now, pausing, if you don't know your Genesis stories, remember when Joseph is interacting with his brothers in Egypt when he's, a pharaonic official, and his brothers have come down from the starving land of Canaan to seek food from Egypt, and they have that interaction where he knows them but they don't know him. He actually plants a cup in the baggage of little Benjamin, his young brother, and then accuses them of having thieved it and creates a whole scandal. I mean, you can look up the story if you don't know it. But that cup is being associated with this mantic practice of reading the future in the dregs of the wine cup. Okay, so and they say that the Hellenes, the pagan Greeks, uh, say that through a manic mouth, like a divinely possessed manic mouth, bring the water, bring the wine, O slave, get drunk. So get drunk and crash out, fall asleep. The cup, uh, or my cup, says what kind of person I need to become. And they say that this does not only concern that which is thought of by humans, namely the cup of Anacreon, who's the poet from which that quote is taken, um, the cup that, speaks without making sound, without speaking, this ineffable mystery cup. So again, the St. Hippolytus is telling us that the Gnostics, the Naascenes, in quoting this line from Anacreon about the cup that is brought to him by his pious, his slave, uh, which he gets drunk on and crashes out on, that it was also like apparently a mantic cup that could prophesy and that it could convey things, it could speak even though it made no sound. Okay. Um, so they say that the cup of Anacreon is speechless, does not make sound, um, on account of which they say that Anacreon could speak through a speechless sound about what he was to become, what kind of person he was to become. That is to say, specifically a pneumatic person, a spiritual person, and not a sarkic person, a carnal person. For if one, or for if you hear the hidden mystery in silence. So there's this idea that I guess the person who can read the mantic cup in the manner of Joseph and Anacreon is like a spiritual person as opposed to a carnal person. Okay, they're of the elect race as opposed to the accursed race, the spiritual people, not the carnal people. Okay, and this is the water that is in the noble gamoi weddings or instances of coitus, right? Um, wherein, well, in this case, it's the weddings, I should say, because it's referring to Cana. It's just worth pointing out, though, that gameo, the verb, and gamos, the noun, means marriage, yes, but in the ancient world, marriage is very strictly associated with sex, right? I mean, it should be obvious. Um, but yeah, so when Jesus turned and made wine, made the water wine at this wedding in Cana. Um, so they connect that dynamic we were talking about, the mantic cup, with that miracle at Cana, because a lot is conveyed by that action, a lot of mystagogic truths. Keep in mind that in the gospel that tells this event, the wedding at Cana, the number of vessels that are transformed from water to wine correlates with the number of days of creation. And there is an implication that through the blood wine of Christ, a new creation will be instituted. That's kind of the meaning of that event, which I don't know if people like know that. They probably don't. All right, so um, and he says that this is the great and true arche or beginning or cosmogonic principle of these signs. Because remember, it's the first miracle, it's the start of his miracles, but it's also a new creation. So it's an arche in both senses. It's a beginning, but it's also like a cosmogonic event as well, a recapitulation of creation that's reinstituted. Okay. Which Jesus made in Cana of Galilee when he revealed the kingdom of heaven. Okay. And they say that this kingdom of heaven is like lies within us and is a treasury and is the leaven that is hidden within the three um, measures of flour. And they say that this is the great and ineffable mystery of the Samothracians, right? The mystery of the Cabaroi is being alluded to now, which it is only possible for those who have been initiated to know, they say, and then it is spoken of in extensively by the Samothracians that this Adam was given to them in the mysteries to those who were initiated um, by them, namely the arcanthropos, this arche man, this first man who is the beginning, the cosmogonic principle, the arche. All right. And there are two statues, a galmata, cultic statues, in the um, anacteron, that is like the cultic mystery initiation building. It's related to the word, um, well, I mean, we'll talk about that later, but this anacteron, this building where the initiation rite occurs, um, there are two statues therein of naked humans who have their hands like stretched upwards, both towards the heaven, and who have their shameful thing, i.e., their pudenda, right? Their what's over here, them genitalia, right? They have their pudenda, stretched up, turned upwards as well, just like Hermes of Cylene, Silene or Kylene. Um, So yeah, these are Herms that I show images of over here, famous priapic depictions of Hermes, the divinity, and such statues like that, but with hands facing upwards to heaven, were apparently in the initiation chamber of the Samothracian mysteries, and that chamber was called the Anactoron. Okay, so these icons, these images that were just these aforementioned agalmata or statues of the first man, the Acanthropos, um, the one who is regenerated, rebirthed as a pneumatic, as a spiritual being, they, according to all things, are like of the same essence as that anthropos. They say that this thing that was said by the Savior, quote, if you drink my blood and eat my flesh, you or if you don't drink my blood and eat my flesh, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. But rather, if you drink, they say, this cup which I drink, and go where I go, or rather, yeah, sorry, if you do not drink this cup which I drink, um, you shall not be able to enter where I shall go. Right? So it's twofold, and that's quite a brilliant combination of those two quotes, right? Yeah, it's referring to communion as a vital initiation rite to enter the kingdom of heaven, but also you have to drink his cup in the sense of you have to suffer in the way he did as well, right? Because remember, Christ famously says, take this cup from me, but I shall not do what I want, but as you want, O Father, when he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane at that key moment, right? It's that whole thing of like, I don't want to die painfully, please. So saith Christ's human nature, but his divine nature knows, nonetheless, even though I'm scared and I don't really want to die like in this manner, I know that this is thy will, my will, and it must be done. And so my human nature shall capitulate to the divine will. Because both in I, as a dual natured being, both man and God, though I struggle as a human and I'm scared as a human, I know my divine duty as God, and as such, I subjugate my human nature to my divine will, and marry those two differing wills, which were initially divorced, or not initially, but were divorced in the fall. I reunify them, right? That's the Orthodox understanding. And something similar is happening here in the Gnostic cosmology as well. Okay. Uh, and they say that he knows from which nature each of of his disciples um, came into by necessity their own nature. And of the 12 tribes, he selected 12 of his disciples, and he said to each of the tribes, they say, on account of this, the preachings of the 12 disciples, not all people heard them, and if they heard them, not all were capable of receiving them. So he's just St. Hippolytus is just pointing out that the Nicene Gnostics interpret these scriptures pertaining to the 12 disciples and so on as meaning like, oh, not everyone was capable of receiving like the Gnostic message, only the elect were. Okay, there were accursed individuals who could not understand it. But it's just interesting that we got this mention of these priapic statues in the Samothracian mystery cult Anactoron, like being identified with the Arcanthropos, the first human, the human who is the arche, the cosmogonic principle, namely the hermaphroditic Adamas that we've been speaking about. And that this state of priapism and being directed upwards towards heaven is related, right? That the sperma, the seed fell down, but then shoots back up. And we can think of the Daveni papyrus, right, where there's like a pun on leaping forth into the ether and ejaculating into the ether. There's something about that. This like penis imagery is like very central to Greek mystery religion and consequently to Gnostic thought, it would seem. Okay, so so among them, that which is against physis, against nature, is not in accordance with nature. And they say this thing that the Thracians who are about Mount Hymos, uh, who dwell there, they call him, presumably the first man, Corybas, which is where we get the Corybantes from. That is among the Thracians. And then the Phrygians do something rather similar, that from the Coruphae, from the summit or peak or apex, right, from on high, cometh from the uncharacterized encephalus, that is the brain, that is not, that remember, does not have a character, does not have an embossed or engraved like distinct shape. It is formless, from the formless substance of the brain that is on high, that is at the apex, at the coryphae, the summit, cometh downwards from on high the archae, the beginning, or the cosmogonic principle or anthropogonic principle, and it goes downwards in a catabasis, a journey downwards, a catabasis, and it takes on all the archai, or like the principles, the source points, the beginnings that are situated there as it moves through downwards. But we cannot fully conceive of what manner in which it goes down. So pausing there for a second. This is interesting. So remember my earlier talk about Greek theory about the brain matter being like this divine essence that has no form. It shoots down from the brain, down the spine, out through the penis during coition, right? And in that process, in moving through the body, it collects data, it gains all these forms, these characters, caracteres, right? These shapes, and then it moves into the womb and starts plastically molding the human as a statue, as an agolma in the womb, right? So that whole process of spermatogony, right, the generation of sperm in the brain and traveling out into the womb, which is anthropogony, which is how humans are generated, that whole process is being linked to Corybas, this mystagogic first man of the Thracian and Phrygian cults, and a pun that comes from that connects his name, Corybas, or Corubas rather, Corubas to Coruphae, right? The summit or peak, which is the head in the human body. So it's interesting that there were apparently these spermatic head conceptions in these mystery rites, if we can believe this account. All right. And this thing, they say, is the thing said that we have heard his voice, but his form we have not seen, which is a quote, I believe, from a canonical epistle ascribed to St John the theologian in the New Testament about the invisible character of God and how no one's seen him. Okay. We only see him through his icon, not his true unmediated nature, which is inconceivable. Okay. And they say that this this thing is like designated and characterized, embossed, engraved. That is the voice that is heard, but the form which comes down from on high, from out of the undepicted or uncharacterized, unetched, unembossed thing, is such that no one has seen it. So it's just that distinction that I just mentioned of like the emanated or generated logos and icon, likeness, or image one can see, one can interface with, but the undepicted ultimate source, no one can really fully perceive. Okay. And there is in the coic plasma, right? That is to say, the earthen molded vessel, um, but no one knows it. Okay. And this, they say, is the cataclysm. This is the one who inhabits, that's a participle oikon, who inhabits the flood, the cataclysm, namely God, according to the Psalms, who is spoken of, who calls out and cries out from the many waters. And they say the waters, the many waters, is the like multifarious or much splitted genesis of mortal humans, from which the undepicted, unembossed, uncharacterized anthropos cries. He cries, deliver, saying, deliver me, deliver my only begotten soul from the lions, which is another psalmic quote. So pausing there, what on earth is being said here? So the multifarious waters of multiplicity, right? That is like the incarnation of the divine soul, of the hermaphroditic Adamas in this world of generation, right? So the undepicted, the akarakteriston, right? The uncharacterized, undepicted divine essence of Adamas, the noetic hermaphrodite, the anima mundi, the grand soul of the universe, gets dragged down into the waters. And these psalmic quotes about God dwelling in the flood waters and crying out and man wanting his soul to be saved from the lions are connected to this dynamic of the divine logos getting incarnated in the chaotic waters of this world. Okay. Um, and they say that to this one, it is said, or of this one it is said, my child, you are my child, O Israel, do not be frightened. For if you pass through the waters, uh, they shall not like encompass you. If you pass through the fire, you shall not be burnt. So I think that's a quote from Isaiah, but again, it's this Exodus and baptismal language, right? Of you pass out of the land of darkness of Egypt through water and fire, because remember there was a fiery tornado leading the Israelites through the Exodus as well, um, as part of the theophany. And so there's this whole concept of baptism of fire and spirit and water. There's wind, flame, and water in the Exodus and the baptismal event. Indeed, few people know that in like the extra biblical explanations of Christ being baptized in the River Jordan, there is like a fiery manifestation and a whirlwind as well. So it harkens back to the Exodus, where you get the tornado, the flame, and the waters parting. It's this imagery of recreation, right? Okay, returning to the text. They say that rivers um, are the watery essence of generation, and fire, this is the Naassene Gnostics, and fire is the like desire and thrust, the horme for Genesis. Remember, horme thrust is where we get hormone from. And you can think of like St. James' epistle in the New Testament, the canonical New Testament, where he speaks of the trokos tes geneseos, right? The wheel of generation, right? Referring to like the fact that, there's this cog of carnal desire that doth churn in our organism, right? Um, okay, so you are mine, do not be scared. And again, quote, they say, um, should a mother forget her children and not have mercy and not give forth her breast, then I should forget you. And they say that Adamas says this towards his own people. So these quote taken from, I believe, the prophet Isaiah. Hopefully, I'm getting that right. You can look it up. Um, is being applied to Adamas by the Naassene Gnostics. So they're just identifying the Godhead of the Bible with Adamas, the hermaphroditic proto-man. Okay. And should a woman forget these things, then I shall not forget you, for I painted you upon my hands. And concerning his ascent, that is his rebirthing, his anagenesis, so that he might become spiritual and not be carnal, they say that the scripture says, lift up thy gates, O ye archons, ye princes, and the gates, the eternal gates, shall be lifted on high, and the King of glory shall pass through. And that is the miracle of miracles, the wonder of wonders. Now, pause there. That famous psalmic quote about open ye gates so that the King of Glory might pass through in Orthodox theology is quoted about Christ entering the underworld, where the bronze gates of Hades that are described by the psalmist open up to make room for Christ's entrance so that he can overcome the archons, the principalities of darkness that dwell in the underworld. But also in texts like the Ascension of Isaiah, which is preserved in Coptic, much recommended important text that you can check out. In that text, we get use of these lines in reference to the way that when Christ incarnated, the Logos descended down from the heavens to become a human in the womb of Mary. When that occurred, he passed through all the heavens, the seven heavens, and passed through these angelic gates, and they opened for him. But the angels didn't know what was going on. They're like, who's this fella coming through? I don't know what's going on. They didn't get that the King of Glory, the Logos, the Messiah, God himself, was coming down through these gates and passing through the guardhouses of all these angels, because the incarnation of God was a mystery even unto the angelic principalities who, are privy to God's plan as members of the divine council. Nonetheless, they didn't know about this. And the Ascension of Isaiah is a text that very vividly describes it. And because there's some crossover with this Naassene Gnostic content, some people wrongly identify that text, the Ascension of Isaiah, as being Gnostic. I don't think it is. I think it's pretty standard, pretty orthodox, that text. I think what happens is because people don't know orthodoxy very well, and then they read like Gnostic material, and there is always commonality because they're doing similar things in some ways. Like there's a category error. Like people throw around the term Gnostic way too loosely, and they don't really know what they're talking about. That's my opinion. Anyway, whatever. Going back to the text. So they say, who is this King of Glory? He is a worm and not a man, an embarrassment for mankind and a weakness to his people. That is the King of Glory, the one who is strong in battle. So that quote about being a worm, one of my favorite lines from the Psalms of King David from the Old Testament. I'm a worm and not a man, a reproach to my people. Indeed, I very much am a worm and a reproach to my people. But yeah, so there's that. That's applied to God in his humility and his condescension. Um, in his incarnation as a man. But then there's also like he is strong in battle. That's a famous description of God that's found in uh, the book of Exodus. And it's quite amazing that he's actually called a man of war. And, today in modern parlance, people think of God being a god of war, like as spooky and that makes them sad or whatever. But what is interesting is that I don't think the folks should be on the war part. Like whatever, that is what it is. I think what's interesting is that he's a man. That God should be a man is actually the like a humanoid, like a person, a human person. That's actually the controversial part because you so often hear in rabbinical Judaism that the Godhead is very distinct from humanity, but you do get these parts of the Hebrew Bible where the word ish, mortal man, is like applied to God. And obviously, Christianity runs with that in the whole idea of the incarnation, whereas rabbinical Judaism rejects it. In the Talmud, there's disputes of this character, but it really takes off like with Maimonides and later rabbinical thinkers who are like, frankly, more in line, like are interfacing a lot with Islam, which is, expressly anti-Trinitarian and combating Orthodox Christianity in its articulation of theology. But anyway, that's just by the wayside. Okay. So they call war uh, the war in the body, and the body is plastically molded as a plasma, as a creation of ceramic, so to speak, of molding, out of belligerent elements, right? Makima stoicheia, right? Elements that are at war. So there's a common idea in the ancient world that the elements clamber against each other in a perpetual state of war in our material world, and that is why you get like degeneration and decay and organisms fall apart, right? Because the elements within their bodies are at war, and heat and cold are clashing, which causes sickness and decay and eventual dissolution. Okay, so as it is written, they say, um, remember this war that occurs in your body. Okay. And they say that this entrance through the gate is seen when Jacob went to Mesopotamia, which they, just as when one becomes a teenager from childhood um, and becomes a man, that is to be known to the one who goeth into Mesopotamia. And they say that Mesopotamia is the great flow of the ocean, of Oceanus, which floweth from the middle of the perfect man. So remember earlier that talk about how like the souls of the gods and of mortal humans come from the same source, that is Oceanus, that floweth out of the great celestial man Adamas, the hermaphrodite, the Logos, right? That's what is being said there. Okay, and then that's applied to like the the story of Jacob traveling to Mesopotamia. And again, we got to you got to keep in mind, right, that the motif throughout the book of Genesis of like crossing over river boundaries, whether it be Mesopotamia, whether it be the Jordan, or whether it be the Exodus in the sea, it's related to the very conception of what it is to be a Hebrew, because ever to Hebrew, right, comes from the verb to cross over, right? The Hebrews are the crosser overers, the ones who cross over boundaries. Um, and that's why boundary crossing, is so central to the Paschal cosmology of the Exodus, Pesach, the Passover, right? Okay, cool. From death unto life, from slavery unto freedom. It's all about transitions across bodies of water through the watery chaos of death into life, right? Okay. And that is why, like, the Oceanus is the great cosmic river on the rim of the world, which is where the land of the dead and the land of the living meet, the boundary. It makes sense that these syncretic Naassene Gnostics would take that Homeric image and combine it with the biblical image, right? Because they are related. They're kind of, this is a universal human trope, the idea of like the waters of death and passing through to life and so on. It's not a uniquely biblical concept, it's quite universal. All right. Um, so where were we up to? And he was astonished at this celestial gate, saying, "This place is frightening, and this thing is not, but rather it is the house of God. It is the gate of heaven. And on account of this, they say, Jesus says, I am the true gate." Quote from the Gospels. Um, And he is the one who says these things, who cometh from the uncharacterized one, right? The akarakteriston, right? The non-embossed, non-engraved, non-depicted Godhead, right? The transcendent, non-image based, non-depicted Godhead. And they say that the perfect man, the teleos anthropos, was embossed or engraved or depicted from thence, from on high, right? So it's all about like the image of the plasma, the lower man, who is the image being like grafted out of the undepicted original noetic man. Okay. And they say that he is not capable, the perfect man, the teleos anthropos, is not able to be saved unless he's reborn through this gate, through this celestial gate. And they say that this, the Phrygians call Papas. Now, pausing there, Papas is the Phrygian name for like a Zeus equivalent, like a father of the gods, like a key capital G divinity, right? Who's called Papas, which obviously means Papa, daddy, which is a pretty natural name for the Godhead, I suppose. All right. And all these things ceased to sinfully or unmusically plemelos, which is a term that occurs in the Timaeus, and to disorderly um, be moved about before his revelation. Okay, so that's simply to say that, you know, um, things in this world of Genesis of begetting are like moving in a state of disorder, but and sin and lack of musicality, but the high god of the Phrygians, Pappus, who is Adamas, the hermaphroditic logos, he like restores such chaos to his own original order. He can reincorporate the multiplicity of chaos back into his singular monad of order. Okay. And they say that this name Pappus, um, along with all of the things that are celestial altogether, as well as on earth and as well as chthonic, are so called. So Pappus, the Godhead, is like the plenitude of all things, the things on high in the heavens, the things on earth, and the things below the earth. Cease from this lack of symphonia, this lack of harmony and agreement in the cosmos, and instead make peace to all those who are distant. That is, make peace among the hylic and choic people who are near, and also peace among the pneumatic, the spiritual, and the noeric perfect humans. So that is to say, the Koic people, remember, the earthen people, the lowly, contemptible people. The Hylic people, the people of Hule, people of matter, similarly, are lowly material people. And peace needs to be made, and they need to be yoked together with those who are spiritual and those who are noeric, those who are the perfect humans. Okay. And the Phrygians say that this is cadaver, this is dead body. So the Phrygians identify apparently the godhead Papas in their mystery cult with a dead body. This is quite interesting, right? Because it's quite like proto-Christian, right? Apparently, the pre-Christian Phrygian mystery cult had this conception of the godhead Papas as being the supreme source of life, the ultimate unitary monad godhead, but also being a dead body, much like Christ, right? Is the divine logos, the undying true God, but he's also just a dead man in that moment of his entombment. And he yokes these two opposites of a dead body that we expect to decay with the glorious undying Godhead. It's amazing oxymoron or paradox, right? And that's apparently present in the Phrygian mystery cults, if we are to believe St Hippolytus's information here. So the Phrygians say that this Godhead Pappus is also a nekus, a cadaver, a dead body, and this expresses the fact that he is buried in a tomb or in a grave, which is the body. So I've spoken about this extensively in my other videos, that the Orphics emphasize that the soma, the body, is a sema, is a tomb, and they pun on the soma sema, body tomb situation. But here, what we're being told is that the Phrygian godhead Pappus, as like the world soul, also is entombed in our bodies as mortal organisms because our souls are of the same divine essence as the Godhead in the polytheist mystery cult theology and also in the Gnostic theology. Okay. And they say that this thing is said, and this is a quote now from the Gospel of Matthew, I believe, ascribed to Christ, that this is Christ speaking to the Pharisees, right? You are whitewashed tombs that are full of the bones of dead people inside. Um, for and then they add that for there is no truly living man within you. So that is to say that the Gnostics take that quote about where Christ rebukes the Pharisees and calls them tombs, whitewashed tombs that are pretty on the outside, but the inside are full of vile smelling dead bodies and bones. That is taken by the Naassene Gnostics to mean that the true living Godhead, Papas of the Phrygians, who is Adamas, the hermaphrodite logos, is only within those who are of the elect, right? The living man, capital M slash anthropos, is only in the elect living people, whereas you dead fellas are like soulless. You don't have the divine essence soul in you. You only have like corrupt mortal souls. Okay, and again, they say that the dead shall leap forth from the tombs, and this is that those who are reborn as spiritual people, as pneumatikoi, spiritual people, shall jump forth from the choic bodies, from the earthen bodies, for they are not carnal, that they are not sarkikoi. And they say that this resurrection happens through the gate of heaven, and those who do not pass through it, they say, shall remain dead. So this is a key thing to differentiate, that in the Gnostic cosmology, the way you become a spiritual person, a saved person, is you fly out of this earthen body and your soul goes up back through the heavenly gate to return to its true source, Adamas the hermaphrodite. And you are not like those carnal people who simply die and wither away with their bodies, but you go back to your true source. Okay. And they say that the Phrygians call this God from change, from metabole, from transition. So the idea is like you make the transition from mortal life as a human back up to the Godhead in this conception of the Gnostics and the polytheist mystery cults. For they say that he becomes God when he resurrects or rises up from the dead and passes through the gate towards heaven. So the key thing is the Gnostics don't believe in a physical resurrection, right? Because the Gnostics, like the polytheist pagan mystery cult people, they don't like the idea of a physical resurrection. The body is a tomb that we are seeking to escape. The soul must therefore go back up through the heavenly gate to return to its heavenly home, away from this earthen body, because this earthen body is bad, right? That is the conception. Totally different to Orthodox Christianity, where you want to be resurrected physically in your earthen body that gets glorified and enwrapped in star luminescence, but is nonetheless still an earthen body, for we are Adam of Adamah, the earthling of earth, right? Christianity doesn't see earth as a problem. Earth and heaven are wedded in the Christian Orthodox man, right? Whereas in the Gnostic conception and the pagan conception, no, we're a soul in a tomb and we got to fly back up through the heavenly gate. So as such, anastasis, resurrection, rising up in the Gnostic conception is not physically being reconstituted as a marching physical organism, but no, it's about flying out of the body tomb back up to heaven away from this accursed body tomb. Okay, very different understanding of anastasis, of resurrection. Totally different. This is why the Apostolic Orthodox Christians really disagreed with the Gnostics so staunchly, because the whole point of Christianity is physical resurrection, and the whole point of Gnosticism is escape from the body tomb. They are diametrically opposed soteriologies. Okay, so they say that this gate, Paul himself, the apostle, knew when he opened forth, expounded in the mystery, saying, I was taken up by an angel, and I went about to the second or third heaven and into the paradise, where I saw things that one cannot see, and heard things that are ineffable and cannot be spoken, which it is not permissible to say to another human being. And they say that these things, these ineffable things, which are called by everyone the mysteries, they cannot be like taught by by the logoi, the discourses of human wisdom, but rather are in the teachings of the pneuma, of the spirit, and that these spiritual things can be discerned through spiritual people, for the psychic human does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for it is idiocy, moria, moronicness unto him. And these things, they say, are the ineffable mysteries of the Spirit, these things which we alone know. So the Naassenes, who are the spiritual elect, they're the only ones who know the mysteries. They're the only ones who, like Paul, have been up through the gates of heaven to paradise and have seen the ineffable, inconceivable things, and only they can explain them, right? But the non-initiated, non-Gnostics, you fellas, you don't know, right? So they say concerning these things that the Savior said, no one is able to come to me, but if the Father draws him, my heavenly Father draws him forth. Okay, which is a quote from the Gospel of John. And Jeremiah, the prophet, said that who is man that one should know him? And they say that thus the great depths of knowledge of the perfect human, the teleos anthropos, is inconceivable, is inaccessible. For they say that his arche, his beginning or source of perfection of knowledge of the man, is totally dependent on perfection. And they say that he is considered by the Phrygians to be a green, like head of wheat that is threshed, and that after the Phrygians, when the Athenians initiated the mystic rites of Eleusis, they showed forth to those who saw the epopteia, like the final revelation of the initiation ritual of the Eleusinian mysteries, this great and wondrous and perfect epoptic mystery, which was shown forth in silence, namely the threshed or harvested like head of wheat. So pause there. So that's highly significant. And this cool idol that we see over here of like Attis as a baby with a pan flute in his hand, you see over here he's holding three heads of wheat, that you see on the Weet-Bix packets if you're Australian, if you're a Weet-Bix kid. So what's interesting about the information that we're given here by St Hippolytus in his account of Naassene Gnostic beliefs that are taken from the Phrygian mysteries that informed the Eleusinian mysteries, is that at the heart of the revelation was a demonstration of the threshing of wheat. Now, remember how I've spoken about, if you've seen my video, about wine as the blood of baby Dionysus that's reenacted in the mystery rites. What we get here is information about Eleusis and the Phrygian mysteries, where there's a divine baby, right, who is identified with Bacchus slash Dionysus, but also with Attis, um, in this Orphico-Eleusinian context and Phrygian context. And presumably, just like how the wine being crushed, like recapitulates, baby Dionysus's death and resurrection, this crushing of the wheat head, that was the major sight and spectacle of the Eleusinian mysteries. I suggest, in my guesswork using this source and other sources, that just like there's a wine act that shows how baby Dionysus was dismembered and resurrected, so too the baby at the center of the Eleusinian mysteries, who can be identified with Dionysus, but this time in a more grain form as opposed to a wine form, was like sparagmatically dismembered and reassembled in some kind of play or spectacle at this key moment in the initiation rite. So that's partially guesswork on my part, but not really. I mean, it kind of does say that in the text, bolded here. So returning to the text, this head of grain of wheat is claimed among the Athenians to be the illuminating body, um, of the uncharacterized one, the great perfect one, who is the hierophant, right? The great prophet, according to them, who is not chopped up as Attis is, but rather is castrated through hemlock, and is exempt from all carnal generation, for in much flame, the one who performs the initiation rites of the great and ineffable mysteries in Eleusis at night time calls out and cries out, saying, um, the mistress hath given birth to a holy child, holy man child. Brimo has given birth to Brimos. So, and that is to say, the powerful lady has birthed the powerful boy. Okay, so pause there. So Brimo is known to be a cultic epithet of chthonic Persephone, and Brimos is known to be a cultic epithet of baby Dionysus. Hence, Attis and baby Dionysus, as these crushed up and resurrected babies, are being identified here, and it's claimed that by St Hippolytus here in the Refutation of All Heresies, that is at the center of the night ritual, the climax of initiation in the Eleusinian mysteries. And the idea is that the Foster, the luminary, the great light body of the divine that cannot be depicted, that is beyond all conception, gets like incarnated as Attis or baby Dionysus, Brimos, born of Brimo, who is castrated. And it's interesting that there's mention of the hemlock, the corneon, the hemlock beverage in this context, which may mean that when Socrates suicided with that beverage, it had mystagogic significance because it seems to have been involved in the mystery cult, which is pretty cool. And this relates to my hypothesis that the Eleusinian mysteries and the Orphico-Dionysian mysteries, though different, like slightly different, one involves grain, one probably involves wine. There are these slight differences in place and details. Nonetheless, their core dynamic of like the inconceivable Godhead becoming a baby and being torn apart and being reanimated is present. And keep in mind, right, like this notion, even though it's pagan, even though it's adopted by Gnostics, it's still pretty typologically similar to Orthodox Christianity, where the Godhead becomes a baby in the Eucharistic chalice, is torn apart in the melismos, the dismemberment, nonetheless comes back together, brings the multiplicity into the one. Like this is a thing. This is a thing in both paganism, Gnosticism, and Orthodox Christianity. They just differ in, the theologies that they build out of it, but the typology is the same, and you'll find it in other religions as well. Okay. So, who is the Potnia, the mistress spoken of here? They say she is the pneumatic or the spiritual genesis or generation that is celestial and above. Okay. Um, Whereas the powerful one, i.e., the Brimos, the child born, is the one who is thus born. He's the one of whom it is said in the mystery Eleusis and Anactorion. So remember how I said we're going to talk about the word, the Anactoron, the building in which the Samothracian mysteries occur. So now St. Hippolytus is going to treat the word Anactorion, the place where initiation occurs in Samothrace, as well as Eleusis, the toponym of the Eleusinian mysteries. He's going to explain them. So Eleusis means to say that we have come, they say, as spiritual beings, pneumatikoi, from on high, having flowed downwards, ruentes kator, from Adamas. Now, in looking at this flowing downwards, ruentes kator, flowing downwards, remember Phauos ruetes, right, was the godhead that was inscribed on the mystery bridal chamber of the flying mysteries in Attica that are related to the Eleusinian mysteries, where there's an old man with a boner chasing Ficola, the woman. His name is the light that floweth downwards, and he floweth downwards in his raping of this lady of darkness, of the waters, right, of the primordial waters, right? There's something about this that these mystery cults and consequently the Gnostics believed in, like the divine hermaphroditic Godhead, like sending forth his essence into the dark waters of this material reality and flowing downwards. The soul substance of the divine Godhead on high floweth down into the waters below. Right? That is what's being conveyed here. And the reason that relates to the word eleusis is because eleusomai as a verb can mean like I come, right? So I go. So yeah, he's claiming, St. Hippolytus is claiming that the Gnostics and the pagan mysticogues believed that the toponym of the mystery cult Eleusis was relating to come, to go, and it related to the fact that the divine essence came down from on high down into our realm to be incarnated in bodies, and that the mystery rite involving the crushing of this wheat baby related to that dynamic of the undepicted transcendent divine coming down into the world of multiplicity, the one being divided into the many, the God immortal becoming mortal, crushed, but nonetheless reconstituted, victorious, right? It's pretty cool dynamic. Okay. So and there's this verb again, eleusisthai, an infinitive, meaning to come, right? Which is tied to eleusis, the place, which is to come. And the anactorion means to go up. So they say that this thing is said by those who are orgiastically initiated into the mysteries of the Eleusinians. Okay. And this custom is involves the small mysteries, those being initiated into the small mysteries, consequently, soon after, being initiated into the great mysteries. And this is a bit of an odd phrase that follows, but the great apportionings or deaths or fates, I mean, that's what this word moros means. It literally means one's like non-negotiable appointment or destiny. But it can also mean, as such, can mean death because death is, appointed for us all, fortunately or unfortunately. So these great appointments receive by lot, by allotment, greater apportionings or greater fates, whatever that means. And they say that these small mysteries are those of Persephone, who is down below, concerning these mysteries and the road or path or way that leadeth there, and this path or road is wide and spacious and takes those who are to be destroyed down to Persephone. And then there's a lacuna, a bit of a hole in the manuscript, right? Dot, dot, dot. But pausing there for a second, this wide road language we will recognize from like the Gospel of Matthew, Christ speaking of the road to salvation being like narrow and bendy, whereas, the way towards hellish destruction is obviously very broad and easy, which is why most people go that way, I suppose. So that's being thrown into the mix here by these Naassene syncretists in their mixing of Christ's language with the Eleusinian mysteries. But the point that is of interest about discerning what the Eleusinian mysteries might have involved is we know from like Orphic golden tablets, lamellae, sheets, inscriptions thereon, we know that Persephone was like a judge of the dead. So it would seem that there were people who, were sinners who were like destined to be judged adversely by Persephone if they took the bad path as opposed to the good path. It's probably what's being conveyed. And then it says, and they say that the poet said, and the poet, of course, is Homer, that the path is like sharp and rocky with many jagged corners, which is associated with her. It is like um, hollow and muddy, and she who is the best leads there uh, into the desirable grove or little forest, holy forest, of the much honored Aphrodite. And then there's another lacuna there. But what's interesting is, I would say, in my interpretation, I'm not 100% confident, but I think what is being said here is it relates to what we were talking about earlier in discussing the Naassene Gnostic conception of the soul as like entombed in the physical body as a result of erotic desire and copulation. So there's a sense in which Aphrodite leads people down into flesh and death and sin and destruction. So her grove, her sacred grove, is very pretty, right? Eros looks appealing to most people, but once you get entangled, right, it's it's like the Hotel California, right? You can never leave, and it drags you down to hell. Whereas if you keep your sight, I suppose, up on the twisted path that leadeth upwards, you will find salvation, is the kind of Gnostic message. Of course, I suppose there are more positive soteriologies where you can have your cake and eat it too, but that's not the case for these Naascenes, I don't think. Okay, so that's that application of Homer's description of like the path that leadeth to the grove of Aphrodite, and it seems to be given like eschatological meaning in this um, Naassene exposition of the Eleusinian mysteries preserved by St Hippolytus of Rome in his Refutation of all Heresies. But now it gets interesting. We hear about some Phrygian mystic rites involving Attis, and you can see a little baby Attis here in his nice pajamas. Um, okay, so translating the text. And yet the Phrygians, they say that the father of all things, of the wholes, with a W, right, of all things, is Amygdalon. Now, what is amygdalon? Well, you might have heard of the amygdalae, in some of us have very big ones, which makes us, rather rapacious and lascivious. Uh, but the word literally is the almond, okay? Hence why that part of the brain is called that, because it's got the shape of an almond. Now, this is not translating the text. This is not the tree which they speak of, but rather amygdalon is the one who comes forth, who has within himself the perfect fruit, which like signifies the breaking forth and movement within the depth that is cut into his colpoi, right, into his like bosoms, like you can think of the bosoms of Abraham and so on in an eschatological context in Christ's famed parable of the rich man and the poor Lazarus licked by the dogs, right? That's probably what's being referred to here. Um, but it can also mean like, the deep, like the depth of our bosom, like the cavity that is the heart or whatever, the endless pit. Um, and he birthed the invisible and unnameable and ineffable child of his about whom we are speaking. So pause there for a second. It's going to need some exegesis. So we've got Pappus, Big Papa, who's the father god, the godhead of the Phrygian mystery cult. Okay. He's identified with the amygdalon, right, which is not to be conceived of as the almond tree or the almond nut itself per se, according to the mystagogic exegesis, but rather is to be conceived of like as the ultimate theological arche or beginning point slash principle and source, who is like the perfect karpos, the teleos karpos, the perfect fruit, in like the abyss, in the great fog that is the inconceivable divine, right? To borrow some imagery and language from Saint Dionysius the Areopagite's treatment of Moses in the cloud atop Mount Sinai. Right? So that sort of conception, and that there breaketh forth from this inconceivable Father Godhead um, a similarly unnameable and inconceivable and coessential son or child, Pais, right? Paida, of his, about whom we shall now speak. So basically, what's being said is that there's apparently within the conception of the Phrygian mystery rites a theological outlook that is pretty much quite akin to the Orthodox slash Nicene conception of God the Father begetting God the Son before all time. And this is pretty nifty. I mean, I can't help but think of in my own land here in the Antipodes in New South Wales, among the indigenous people known as the Dungari tribe near Kempsey, around those regions, they conceived of the Godhead as Wirrarangbural, and this name is involves like a duality, like a duplicity and identification between the inconceivable Father God and the Son incarnation, who is subject to sporagmos dismemberment in their myths and mystic rites. So it's rather uncanny that this dynamic is found, in among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. It's found among the Phrygians, and it's found in Christian Orthodox theology. And that to me is just the ultimate affirmation of its reality, really. I know that sounds crazy to secular people, but I guess that's what happens when you spend so much time reading this stuff and contemplating these things. You just get assimilated into it, for good or for ill. Okay, so returning to the translation of the text, that was just my personal reflection. You can take that or leave that. All right, so um, we're thinking about Amygdalon, the great almond father godhead pappus of the Phrygian mystery rites. So he scratches this verb amuso is used, which is a verb to scratch, and there's implicitly like an etymological link being made between amygdalon that you can see transliterated into Roman slash English characters on the right bottom, amygdalon the almond slash almond tree, and amuso the verb to scratch or scrape or cut or sever, this kind of to gash open, that kind of meaning, right? And then you can see amukai, right, the wounds which are produced from such scraping, which will come up as well. Okay, so this verb amuksai, it signifies, it conveys breaking forth and cutting, for as they say, when bodies are like inflamed with sickness and they have within themselves a certain sustrophere, a certain like twisting. The doctors call this amukai, right? They call these things these wounds that scraped or cut open from the verb amusor, which relates back to amygdalon, right? Um, they call these wounds such when they like cut them open for medical treatment, and thus they say the Phrygians speak of and call their godhead amygdalon, right? So amygdalon, almond, is being connected to the great cutting of disease and medical treatment. Now, what is the significance of that? Well, we'll get to that. Okay, and so from this came forth and was generated the invisible one, through whom all things were begotten, and without whom nothing that is generated would have arisen. So that again is a quote from St. John's Gospel, the beginning about the Logos. So amygdalos is being conceived of as the Logos through whom all things are generated, just as in the Christian conception. Okay? And the Phrygians, they speak of the Suriktan, that is like the aulos player, like, or the pipe player, pan, pan flute player, something like that, the pipe player who was begotten from thence, for the spirit that is harmonious is generated, and they say that this spirit is God. Okay, so they also identify the child of the amygdalon cutting forth Godhead, who is the Logos through whom all things are generated. They identify that child as the spirit, the harmonious spirit that orders the world, that is to be identified with the Godhead. So there even seems to be like a Trinitarian conception of not only an inconceivable, ineffable Father above, a Logos generated therefrom, but also a uh, spirit that is identified with the Son that exudes forth from the ineffable amygdalon. Okay, so they say that on account of this, they worship in this mountain, which is not in Jerusalem, um, and sorry, and that the true like venerators or worshippers are not in Jerusalem. So it would seem, pausing the translation there, and rather the true worshippers worship in spirit. So that's again like a quotation from uh, St. John's Gospel, right? You might recall very famously when Christ interfaces with the Samaritan woman at the well, and there's that whole thing about she's like, why are you talking to me? If you're a Pharisaic, upright Jew, I'm like a vile Samaritan woman who is lascivious and as copulated with many men. So I'm like, why are you wasting your time with me? We worship on a separate mountain to you, people of Mount Zion. We don't get along. Why are you talking to me? And then Christ says, yes, well, the time now hath come where, the true worshippers will worship in the Paraclete, in the Spirit, and they will, not require a specific mountain. So, I shall yoke together the Samaritans, the Gentiles, and the Jews in one, reconciled divine family. So that's what's being spoken about here. And that quote is being weaponized by these Naassene Gnostics who are syncretized with the pagan mystery rites of the Phrygians, such that they claim that, like, the Phrygian mountain of these rites is just as much the mountain of God as, Mount Zion is. So they say that the pneumatic or spiritual worship, proskunesis, of the perfect people is not carnal. The spirit, they say, from thence is from thence where is the Father, and is also named the Son, and was begotten from thence out of the Father. And they say that this one is many named and many eyed, as in has many eyes, right? And is inconceivable, and that all physis, all nature is from him, and could not otherwise have any like appetite. And they say that this is the word of God, that which they say is the word of the great promulgation or decision of dunamis, of power and potentiality. And on account of this, that which is sealed and hidden and covered shall lie in an abode of which is the root of all things that are established from the ions, from the eons, from the dunames, from the powers, from the epinoei, that is like the noetic intelligences, from the gods, the theoi, from the angels, and from the spirits sent forth, from the onta, from the things that are, the forms, from the mere onta, the not beings, the non-forms, whatever that means, is insanely complicated ontologically, from the things that are begotten or generated, from the things that are ungenerated, from the things that are inconceivable, from the things that are perceived or conceived of, from the years, from the months, from the days, from the hours, from the indivisible moments, from which take beginning or from which start the smallest things that increase according to part, according to proportion or something. So that's quite deep metaphysically, what's going on there. So this is an important thing to understand that maybe a lot of people don't realize about Gnosticism as general as a term that is, we can say more specifically about the Naascenes, but it really applies to all forms of the Gnostic sects, and it includes the Manichees, right? The Manichean religion as well. Is that it's very polytheist. People don't realize like they actually didn't like just worship a singular godhead. They were much like the mystagogues of pagan antiquity. They were like henotheists. Yes, they had a conception of an overarching, sublime, supreme godhead, but they had a multiplicity of gods, divine beings that whom they worshipped that are incorporated into that godhead as well. I guess like modern conceptions of so-called Hinduism. So it's not, it's like, is it monotheism? Is it polytheism? I'll just call it like henotheism. But if you don't believe me, like you can look up bona fide texts that are written by Manichaeans themselves in their own liturgies, and they worship gods and angels and other beings, right? Like a multiplicity of beings. So like there's no doubt about that. It's not just my take. You can check that out. We'll do videos on the Manichaeans at some point anyway, but yeah. All right. So returning to the text. And this bit about the year and the months and so on, the whole conception of the year as like an eternal cycle of divisible parts, and the idea that the astronomical infrastructure of the sky taught man intellection and mathematics and measure and reverence of the divine is something that's very extensively spoken about in Plato's texts, and I think it's just was central to like the mystagogic Orphico-Pythagorean religion, or just generally the mystery cults of Eleusis and so on, in my hypothesis, in my reading of the material. And that's just, and a large part of this mystagogic religion was a reflection on the cycling of eternity as embodied in the astronomical clockwork that institutes the cycling of the year, that shapes the seasons and that shapes the behavior of humans here on Earth. And it really is like a grand image, this image of the ever cycling seasons and the stars above dictating that. And we've lost this because now people know the date by their phone screens, and they don't watch the stars, and they don't have crops, and they don't interface with the heavens because of light pollution. They can't even see the heavens, the stars, and they don't have any relation to nature and growth anymore. And then they use contraceptives to block even the growth of their own seed in their own household. So like it's really we're so far from the ancient worldview. And it's not really just an ancient worldview, it's actually like the world as it is, as opposed to this artificial hell that we've entrapped ourselves in. But, you know, I suppose you're probably happy with your McDonald's and your infertility, so maybe that's irrelevant. At any rate, okay, so returning to the text. So they say that uh, this indivisible moment, stigmare, uh, came from nothing and yet puts together all things and is indivisible. And she like sets up through herself and unto herself an epinoia, like a noetic intelligence that has a size, a grandeur that is inconceivable. Okay. And they say that this, you know, feminine entity is the kingdom of heaven, the mustard seed, right? So pause. You obviously know the famed mustard seed of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew. You know, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest among seeds, but groweth into the grandest tree. And this whole idea of the cosmos and the ultimate eschaton, our end goal is a huge tree wherein all these birds dwell is such a beautiful image, I think. If you like birds and trees, I suppose. Maybe some people prefer Stalinist, brutalist architecture. You know, maybe that's their paradise. I don't know. All right. So, this stigmare, this moment, this indivisible moment, which they associate with the kingdom of heaven, um, that exists in a state of indivisibility, um, they say that no one can know her, stigmare, this moment, except for the pneumatikoi, the spiritual folk, right? As opposed to those vile carnal folk who just don't know nothing, right? And they say that this is the thing said, quote, these are not logoi words, nor are they things spoken, of which those who hear um, their voices, but rather these things are are designed in such a way, or designed in such a way by all people to be said and to be generated towards their own nous, their own mind, saying that all these things shall become spiritual. And from thence they show forth in theatres, and they say of themselves that they shall neither say nor do anything without without forethought. And they say that if the people, the demos, like the public collective of the people, cometh forth in the theatres, they shall go inside wearing a bizarre, like unusual garment, a wild garment, and have a kithara, a musical stringed instrument, that which they shall bear, and they shall be singing psalms and making music, and they shall say, singing the great mysteries, that they do not know what they are saying. And so the people, the demos, the collective people, they come together into the theaters. They enter all in their extravagant garments, and they uh, are holding kitharas, that is, stringed instruments, and they are chanting psalm songs, and they thus speak the great mysteries, not knowing what they are saying, says St Hippolytus. And then we have the bolded quote here: whether you be the genos, the spawn of the race, the stock, the thing generated of Kronos, Saturn, right, the Titan, or of blessed Zeus, Dios Makaros, or of the great Rhea. Now, Rhea in this context is no doubt probably identified with Cybele in Phrygia and Asia Minor generally. Hail, right, Caire, the Katephes Akrisma of Rhea, namely Attis. So a direct vocative address of Attis is Ati on the end there after the comma, and he's addressed as conceived of as the Katephes Akrisma. So that means the one castrated. The akrisma is a person who is subject to the verb akrisdo, which means to castrate or dismember. But in this case, it's the genitalia being chopped off, right? So the castrated one of Rhea, who is Attis, and he's called uh, Katephes, which means having like a downcast gaze. And I imagine if you ever had your genitalia severed, you might look downwards and be a bit upset about it. It might be a natural reaction. Though in some contexts, it may be a relief. It really depends how you're coming at it. At any rate, that's what that bolded line says. And so now we can continue with the translation. Or they call him the like green flourishing head of wheat that is threshed, or they call him the much fruit-bearing amygdalos almond tree that birthed a a pipe-playing man. Okay, so the Sudiktan again. Now, pausing there for a second. So that's referring to Pappus, the grandfather god, like beget Amygdalos, the ineffable, begetting like the sun who emanates down from the head, right? Um, Keep in mind that like Saint Gregory the theologian, when explaining the Trinity, he refers to the Father as the arche, the beginning or principle. He refers to the Logos Son as the metarches, the one who is alongside or along with the principle slash beginning. Um, and then he refers to the um, Holy Spirit as accompanying the beginning, the arche as well. So that maps on rather neatly because if we recall in Hebrew, the book of Genesis is called Bereshit, Be in, and Reshit in the beginning, as it's often translated. But Resh, the word for beginning, that would be arche, NRK in the beginning in Greek. It actually also means head. So it's kind of interesting that it happens to sort of map on rather neatly this idea of the head and the beginning as like the source of emanation, right? And like in the triangular depiction of the Trinity, right? It's the Father that's at the Coruphere, right? At the summit that is identified with the head of Charybdis. So it's kind of interesting how this stuff like maps on rather neatly. And the word that I left untranslated there, "ipolos," used to describe Attis, you have to understand that that means a like a goat herd, okay? Uh, Now goat herd, you might know the word like the Aegean Sea, for instance, that comes from the word "ix" for goat, but ultimately in terms of etymology. But there's also like the term the Aegis, which is the shield of Zeus that is made out of like goat hide, and hence why it has that name because Ix and Aegis that means Ix means goat, right? So that's what the I component means, and then the polos component means like the ones who like shepherd. So he's a goat herd. But what people don't understand about that is that in mystagogic puns that we see already present in the Cratylus of Plato, the term Ipolos, the goat herd that's applied to the god Pan or Pan, who is the faun, right, the half goat man divinity. That divinity is explained by Plato there in the Cratylus as his name means Pan means the all, the capital A all, right? That is the plenitude of the divine macrocosm. And then the polos part is related to the pole in the astronomical sense, right? The the pivot point of the constellations, in the north, so to speak, like the kind of the summit and center really of like astronomical rotation in a sense. And as such, it's like a fitting name for the divine macrocosm, right? The all that is like the focal point of rotation for the celestial bodies, so to speak. Okay, and that is identified with this Logos character, this Son of God, who is also the wheat that is like threshed and crushed in the Eleusinian mystery rites. Okay. And the fact that that etymology of Ipolos as this all goat man being who's also identified with Hermes, who's like of dual nature as well as the Logos, already in the Cratylus, kind of shows that I think a lot of this mystagogic theology, even if some of it is later developments of the Hellenistic and Roman era, nonetheless, a lot of it was already around even in Plato's time, I think we can infer from such things, though other people won't do that, but that's my reading of the matter. Okay, so returning now to St. Hippolytus's Refutation of All Heresies, translating the text, and they say, that is the Naassene Gnostics appropriating polytheist mystagogic material, they say that this one is the many-formed Attis, as in Attis of many forms, whom they praise in their hymns, saying thus, and now this is okay, so I quote now, this is the hymn that is incorporated into the text by St. Hippolytus. This is the hymn that was sung by these pagans in the theatre, apparently, and presumably also in their mystery rites. Quote, I shall sing a hymn to Attis, son of Rhea, not with the droning of um, percussion instruments, of like bells, uh, nor with the Idaean alloy pipes of the Curetes. Now, this word is probably a corruption. I'm not aware of a word muktita. Now, if you change it a little bit with by taking out that tau, you can get to the word mushroom, but it doesn't make any sense. But if you change that tau to a rho and you just move the accentuation, and you get muktera, you get like nose or like like nasal cavity, which may make more sense. The nasal cavity of the Idaean pipes of the Curetes, which means simply like the the pipe, the windpipe of the instruments of the Idaean Curetes, which I think would make more sense, but it's not particularly important. The point is, so not with the droning, the bomboy of the percussion instruments, nor with the drums, we could say, nor with the sound of the alloy, the shrill pipes of the Idaean Curetes, but rather I shall mix in the Phoebian, that is to say, of Phoebus, of Apollo, the Apollonian, muse of the Forminx instrument, which is like something akin to, similar to a like a classical lyre, let's say, along with the Evoi Evan chant, just as with Pan and with Bacchus, Dionysus. Now, Evoi Eva, like we've spoken about this before in other videos, remember Clement of Alexandria connects this chant of Evoe Eva to Eva, Eve of the Bible, because it's a chant that is associated with the Bacchae, the Bacchically Dionysian possessed women who like dance with serpents wrapped around in their hair. And, as we see with like Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great, even copulate with said like divinely possessed serpents and so on in this cult. Okay, so there's that, and remember, there's the mantra of that cult preserved by Clement of Alexandria that the snake passeth through the bosom, dia kolpon, and so on. So that's being alluded to, that chant of Evoy Evan or Evoy Ewan, if you want to use classical pronunciation. Um, and then, and the point is that Pan and Bacchus are being identified with Attis in this hymn, and that makes total sense because remember what I said earlier about Ipolos, right? Like the ever rotating Ayer, I instead of goat, Ayer, always, eternally, ever, and Polos, like rotating celestial pole of the stars. And remember, like in Diodorus Siculus, you get like the dotty uh, leopard skin that Dionysus wears is identified with like the starry sky, and with Phanes, Protagonist Phanes, the godhead, is like the luminous astral being whose female half, remember, is Nux, like star-studded Nut in Egypt and so on. And then he's expressly called this Attis Dionysus Pan being the all, capital A, is also identified as the shepherd, the poimen of the Leucon Astron, of the white stars. So there's that astronomical image. This is ultimately the same being, right, as Protagonist Phanes and Adamas the Arsenothelus, the hermaphrodite, right, the Logos qua um, primordial man and hermaphrodite and starry being, right, and grand musician is the point here. So that's the end of the quote there of that hymn. And on account of these logoi, these discourses, these fellas, they lurk around in these so-called mysteries of the Great Mother, who is Cybele slash Rhea, associated with Attis and his castration. And they look on, and they are accustomed to looking on at the dromena, at the ritual acts played out in this cult. Um, yeah, in the whole of that mystery, right? And they have nothing more than to uh, observe the dromena, the things done in this cult, except they themselves are not cut, right? That is to say, they are not castrated. So pausing the translation there, as you probably know, as you can see, the statue on the right and the frieze, there were these Galloi or Galli who were priests of Attis and Cybele, and part of their get up was wearing female clothing and being castrated. They actually cut off their genitalia and dedicated them to the mother goddess, the god, the mother of the gods, Cybele slash Rhea, in imitation of what happened to Attis, Amygdalus, and all that with the cutting of the genitalia. So this castration of genitals was associated with like the emanation of the Son hypostasis of the Godhead from the ineffable Father, it would seem, if we can follow the account that we've been reading. And that may have resonances with the use of the term idoion in the Deveni Papyrus that I've spoken about in my first video on Protagonist Phanes, which you can check out if you haven't seen. I think, even though they're very far apart chronologically, there's commonality there. Okay, so this ergon, this work alone, do they perform of the castrati, of the castrated Galli priests? For they very bitterly keep themselves guarded and promulgate the abstinence from the homilia, the sexual congress with woman, as if they were castrati, as if they were people with severed genitals. So that's simply to say, what St. Hippolytus saying here in the Refutation of All Heresies, that the Naassene Gnostics are very much involved with the Phrygian mystery rite cult of the Galli, the castrated priests, but they themselves just watch the rites and kind of nerdily stand in the distance, and they don't get amongst it themselves. They don't actually cut off their genitalia. I suppose they're too, they're wusses. But despite being greatly enthralled by the cult and watching the dromina as spectators, it inspires them to live as celibates, right? So they use that symbol and that mythology, which they don't act out themselves because they're too wussy. They nonetheless, are inspired by it and live celibately and abstain from the female touch as a result of what they see there. I mean, some of us just end up living like that by default, not due to choice, but I suppose that's another matter. All right, returning to the text. So the rest of the ergon, of the work, of the deed, as we have already said in great detail through many former writings, they act as if they were castrati, as if they were people with severed genitals. All right. So they honor nothing other than this thing which they call the Naas, which is the Nachash of Hebrew, right? That is the serpent. And that is why they are called Naasines, Naasenoi, right? For the Naas, the Nachash, is the snake, from which they say all temples, all Naoi, that are under heaven are thus called from this word naas, nachash. So pause there, so in case you can't follow. So the Greek word for temple is naos, Naos, naos. And this Naassene sect believed that that word for temple, for a divine shrine, naos, came from naas, nachash, Hebrew for snake. And the reason that is they think that the sacred, the Godhead, capital G God, is to be identified as Nachash, the serpent. This is kind of odd because remember the evil serpentine demiurge Yalda Ba'ot is serpentine, and they don't like that fella, that creator of the material world who's bad. But nonetheless, even though they don't like that snake, they nonetheless conceive of the transcendent, noble, good, capital G Godhead as a snake nonetheless. So they're really stuck with the snake thing. And you can see there's the serpentine like tripod thingo pillar from Delphi that was taken by Saint Constantine the Great to Constantinople and is still there to this day, even though the heads are severed. I don't know when the head severing happened. I think it might have been Ottoman era. I think there might be um, a travel writer who speaks of the head still being affixed in a somewhat late period. But you have to fact check me on that. I'm not 100% sure. And I don't want to slander the poor Ottomans, far be it from me. Alhamdulillah, that's sublimely peaceful empire. Why would I speak ill of such a thing? Uh, okay, so returning to the text. So the Naas, the Nachash, thus lies as something totally hieron, holy, um, alone, and all, it is like every teleter, every like initiation ritual, and every mystery rite, and no one is able at all to find a teleter under heaven, an initiation rite under heaven, um, in which there is a temple and not also find Naas, the serpent, Nachash, therein as well, which is why the temple is called such, why the Naos is called the Naos. So all that's simply being said is that that St. Hippolytus of Rome, in his Refutation of All Heresies, explains the Naassene sect's self-designation as such, based on the belief that they think that the Naos, the temple, is from the Naas, the snake, but also that they believe that every mystery rite and every initiation ritual involves the serpent. Now, I don't know to what degree that's exactly true, but it's not too unreasonable, like anthropologically. I mean, snakes/dragons crop up in a lot of tribal initiation rites, anacondas, whatever the case may be. Certainly in the Orphico-Dionysian cults, there were lots of snakes, we know from like Clement of Alexandria and so on. We know that in the Orphic Rhapsodies or the Hieronyman theology, as it's so called, ascribed to Orpheus, that Persephone and chthonic Zeus, when they copulated to make Dionysus Zagreus, were in serpent form. So, it's a thing. It's not totally like erroneous, but that was their belief, okay? The Naassenes. And they say that the snake, the serpent, the office, is the liquid essence Just as Thales of Miletus, the pre-Socratic philosopher who said water was the source of all things, was the ultimate cosmogonic principle and beginning point, the arche, that nothing of all the things that are in their totality, whether they be immortal or mortal, um, are capable of being put together either ensouled or non-ensouled without it, without this watery snake essence, they say. For all things like take on their substance therefrom, and it is the good itself, and it contains all things in itself, just as the horn of the one-horned Tauros or bull, um, just as the beauty and seasonal comeliness that is given to all things that are according to physis, according to nature, in their own familiarity. And it thus conveys through all these things that there is a like a river that floweth forth out of Eden that is split schismatically into four archi. So this is referring to now the idea of the Garden of Eden as having four rivers, which we're going to soon see a visual depiction of. So they associate the divine ultimate principle of the Naas, the snake, with waters, and they refer to like the highest waters, which like Thales of Miletus is like the ultimate source, as coming from Eden and sprouting down into four rivers from Mount Eden itself. Now, on that point of the four rivers of Mount Eden, you will see bird's eye views here on the right of the famous Taj Mahal in northern India. Now, this is a like mausoleum, a mortuary complex that was made by a rather famous Mughal ruler for his beloved dame. You know, as you do, when you entomb your beloved lady, what do? Well, you make her tomb a paradise, a literal paradise. Now, for those who don't know, paradisos, the word paradise, is a Greekified form of a Persian word. Indeed, in Hebrew too, Pardesh would appear to be from the Persian word. And in Persian, you have the para component, the first part, the prefix, which means peri, like a roundabout, just like, you know, periscope or whatever the case may be. Um, and then the dace part, dace is cognate with Greek tekos, tichos in modern Greek, which is wall. Okay, so the wall around. So the idea is that the paradise is a walled garden. And then the idea is that a paradise has four rivers. Now you can see here in the aerial shots of the Taj Mahal paradise, Persian garden, that it has four rivers in cruciform formation. It's very pretty. It's like a cross. You know, obviously the Orthodox Christians will read into the Garden of Eden the fact that this perfect, you know, landscaping work of art produced by God Himself, planted by God in the East, it's hardly surprising that it should be cruciform, given that, you know, the divine plan of God was to redeem the world and express His love through that form, that shape. You know, so would the Orthodox see it. But obviously, Gnostic folk and Islamic folk won't particularly like that. But there's also the idea that Adamas, remember, as I signified before, the name Adamas expresses the cardinal points, right? Anatole, east, Dusis, west, the setting and rising points of the sun, Arctos, north, the bear, and Messimbria, south, Adam, right? You know, north, south, east, west. And as such, you know, those cardinal points are expressed by this format as well. And in the Naassene Gnostic conception, right, the Logos, the ultimate font, the Godhead, the ineffable Godhead, is the hermaphroditic Adamas, who is the cardinal points. So it fits into their cosmology just as neatly as it does the Orthodox conception with the cross. But I don't think many people know that, right? That paradise is a garden, that the rivers flowing thenceforth, the four rivers, make up like a cardinal point compass across. It's Very pretty, I think. Okay. So now we're going to return to the text, and this is like the last part of what I'll be translating from St. Hippolytus's treatment of the Nicene Gnostic cosmology. And we're going to see that the Nicene Gnostics map Eden onto the brain of the head, which is something we've been tracking throughout this treatment of the Naassene Gnostic appropriation of Greek polytheist mystagogic theology. Is there is this idea of the divine essence as the sperma, the spermatikos logos, the spermatic logos that dwelleth in like the myelos, like the juice of the brain that comes down the spine and out through the balance during coition, right? And as such, like the whole emanation of creation, the beginning of the sun and his descent into the created world is conceived of in this way as coming down from the reish, the beginning, the head, the arche, the kephale, the korube, the pinnacle that gives us koribas, right? The divine um, Godhead of the Thracians, and then it cometh down in this manner, okay? So translating the text now, Eden, and for those who don't know, Eden is translated into Greek as trufeo, trifi, and that means delight, right? The Garden of Eden is the Garden of Delight. Okay, so Eden, they say, is the encephalus, the brain, and this signifies that there is bound and tightly wrapped up therein in these chitons, these like robes that lie about and around it, just as in the heavens. So pausing there, there's an analogism between the head and the brain encased in the cranium and the heavens. This is hardly surprising. You can think of the Norse creation myth where the slain giants, uh, the dome of his head is used to construct the dome of the firmament. And you can also think of the Timaeus of Plato, wherein there is a direct analogism drawn between the anima mundi that cycles about the heavens and the nous soul that is within our little head. For our little head is a little spherical heaven, much like the one above. And there is analogism between the divine macrocosm and our little microcosmic soul in the head, our cephalic soul, right? So, okay, return to the text. And they consider that paradise is the dwelling place of the head of man. For from thence cometh out the river that cometh out of Eden, and this is from the encephalus, from the brain, and it is appointed into four archi, like four starting points, and they call this the name of the first river Phaison, Pison, and this is the one that circulates about all the land of uh, Evilat or Havilat, which I mean, if you follow like the Syriac text called the Cave of Treasures or the Arabic language text of the Kitab al-Magal, you'll identify that land with like perhaps Ethiopia or perhaps Yemen, Oman, like that kind of zone, like the land of Sheba, the Queen of Sheba, that sort of thing, which makes sense, I suppose. It also may have connotations of being associated with Ophir, which some think is in India, the famed gold of Ophir. And, India and Ethiopia were conflated in the ancient Greco-Roman like conception. It's not particularly important, the geography of the matter. You can look up the genealogies of these characters in the book of Genesis if you're interested, but that give their names to these toponyms at any rate. So there is gold, which I mentioned, right? The gold of Ophir. Gold, the gold of the beautiful gold of this earth, of this land. And there is also anthrax, like coal slash diamond, and green rock. And they say that this is the eye, which through honor and through the colors or shades of the martyrs, or rather, which is worthy of such a name of like the emerald, because on account of the honor and the colors that it testifies to. So simply saying that, like, if you look at someone's eye, someone's shiny, colorful eye, it's like a precious stone. So they identify the brain with the Garden of Eden, from whence the rivers flow, the spermatic rivers that, divinize and hydrate and give life to the whole cosmos. Indeed, pausing there, like Saint Ephrem the Syrian, who's a famed Orthodox Church father writing in Syriac, but whose works were also translated into Greek to some extent, though they may be works of his disciples rather than him. That's a long story. Who cares? But the point is, he, in his Syriac hymns on paradise and his commentary on Genesis, identifies the rivers of Eden as like these super celestial fonts that like spill down goodness down from the sky into our world, which I think is a very pretty image. He's probably related to this conception here. And the idea of like the eye as a precious stone is kind of cool, I suppose. Though I don't know many people who have pretty green or blue eyes. Most of us just have muddy, ugly eyes. But at any rate, the returning to the text, so the name of this second river is Geon or Gihon, and this one circles about all the land of Ethiopia. And this, they say, is hearing because this river is like labyrinthine, very twisted and bendy like a maze, which assumingly is like the cochlea of our ear. It's a bit of a maze type labyrinth situation in the ear. Um, Remember that word, like the cochlea is related to the word for snail because a snail shell is a spiral and our ears are kind of spirally. Incidentally, like everyone's ear shape is actually totally unique. I don't know if you knew that. It's like a fingerprint, you know, your particular spiral formation, your particular labyrinth, you're special, you're unique. How about that? Returning to the text, the third river by name is the Tigris, and this river floweth out from the land of the Assyrians. And this, they say, is smell, the sense of smell. For one useth this sharp movement of like winds. So for whatever reason, the swiftness of the Tigris is associated with like the sharp swiftness of our ability to sniff and smell. So what's happening here is you've got the brain is Eden, and then the various senses, sense perceptions like hearing and smell associated with the head and consequently with our sense of perception are being identified with particular rivers of Eden, right? For this river goeth forth before the Assyrians, just like the spirit, the wind that is breathed out when we engage in respiration, um, and and there is a part of air that is sharper and more violent that is, dragged in from the outside air and comes in as wind. And they say that this anapnoea, this respiration, is phusis, is nature. So they're punning on the fact that phusis, the word for nature in ancient Greek, can be like linked through folk etymology to a verb like fusa or like to breathe out, right? So the nature is nature, phusis is the grand like exhalation or whatever. All right, and then there is the translating, there is the fourth river, the Euphrates, and they call this the mouth through which the exodus of prayer occurs, right? The outflowing of prayer and the inflowing of nutrition, of food. And if one is overjoyed or if one is nourished, one characterizes this as the pneumatic, the spiritual, perfect human, teleos anthropos. And this, they say, is the water that is above the firmament, of which the Savior. So now this is the quotation from Christ, from John's Gospel, where he's talking to the Samaritan woman. So if you knew who the one asking was, you would ask from him to give you water to drink, namely water which leapeth, which jumps. So remember, Christ meets the woman by the well, and she's drawing water at midday in the peak's heat to not be seen because she's an adulteress, and Christ, reveals that fact to her, knows how many men she's slept with, and all these sorts of things. And then they have this exchange about living water. And remember, water in the context of the Naassene cult has particular significance because, like in the thoughts of the pre-Socratic philosopher Thales of Miletus, water is the arche, right? The ultimate cosmogonic principle. So returning to the text, and they say that with respect to this water, all of nature, all of phusis, um, comes and elects their own essences and it cometh forth to each nature from this water its specific, distinctive, familiar characteristics, its own characteristics, they say. Um, Much like how iron is drawn to the Heraclean stone, to the magnet, or gold to the tailbone of the seahawk, or hay to the electron, to the amber stone. And they say that if one is blind from birth and does not see the true light, that light which illumines every man who cometh into the cosmos, that's from the Gospel of John, through us he shall come to see again and shall know. And this signifies that through the paradise, the walled garden, that is that has within all kinds of plants bearing many diverse seeds, with water passing through all of these diverse plants and seeds. And he shall see that it is from the one and from this water that uh, the olive tree gathers and breaks forth its olive, and the grapevine its wine, and every other one of each of the plants according to its genus. And this, they say, is that man who is without honor in the cosmos. He shall be much honored in the next cosmos by those who do not know him. He shall be considered a droplet from a vessel. But we, they say, are the ones who are pneumatikoi, spiritual people, and we are like elected by the living water that floweth from the Euphrates through Babylon, um, with the familiar characteristic. Through this gate, we pass in our road through this gate of truth, and that gate of truth is the blessed Jesus. So pausing there, in the case of the Naassenes, what that means is that, when the souls, the divine souls, come down from the hermaphroditic Adamas logos, they pass through, remember, the celestial gates of the layers of heaven as they come down to be incarnated. And that is conceived of as the river Euphrates spilling out of the mountain of paradise of the walled Garden of Eden, coming down, which is likened to the human head, and its spermatikos logos, coming down from the juice of the brain down the spinal cord and out through the balanus. All right, so and we are from all of these people, we are the Christians alone. And in this third gate, we complete the mystery and are Christically anointed there with the ineffable, unspeakable chrism from the horn. And this is like the horn from which David was anointed messianic king, not one, not like a flask of clay, they say, as was Saul rendered king, but for he was like a companion of a wicked demon, the wicked demon of carnal desire. Okay, so pause there. So presumably the horn of this third gate of heaven is like the horn of the moon, right? Like the crescent moon. And as the souls pass through there, they get like Christically anointed, as appointed as pneumatikoi, elect spiritual individuals who shall return to the Logos and who are true gnostikoi, true knowers of God, who are better than everyone else, and this sort of thing. This idea of souls like passing through planetary bodies on the way down, we shall establish when I look at the Orphic afterlife and our ancient sources on that. It's very much like an Orphico mystagogic concept that is found in ancient sources. And you can see there this beautiful painting by James Tissot of King David playing music to quiet the disturbed soul of King Saul in the Hebrew Bible. If only I was wealthy enough to have a musician to do that for me. I have to just use Mozart's Requiem on repeat on YouTube with its ad breaks, which are very frustrating. At any rate, that's a me problem, I suppose, not your problem. Okay, so moving on. So now we come to the like famed Naassene hymn, which is an extensive like poem that St Hippolytus's Refutation of All Heresies preserves, and there's a little intro before the hymn is quoted, and I shall translate now. So these things, out of many things, we shall put forth a few of them. For there are like an innumerable number of arguments of moronic stupidity that are most like babbling in character and are most manic. But since this this knowledge, this gnosis is agnoston, this knowledge is unknowable or is not very knowledgeable. It can be either unknown or not knowledgeable, and it's probably both that is intended because it's not knowable because it's so hard to understand, and it's also not knowledgeable because it isn't as bright as it purports to be, in the opinion of St. Hippolytus and the Orthodox, right? So, since this not so knowledgeable knowledge of theirs with respect to its dunamis, its power capacity, we shall put forth. Uh, and it seems that this thing we should put forth, namely a psalm that is among them designed thus, and through which all things, through them, all things of deception or mysteries of deception, it would seem, uh, come forth. And they sing in hymns thus. Okay, so that's just his intro, putting it down. And now we proceed to the verbatim um, quoted, preserved text that was used by the Naassenes in their cultic context themselves. And you can see how cryptic it is as I translate. The public domain translation of this in English, incidentally, is not very good. I don't know which manuscript recension it's using, but it's not really that much like what we have in front of us here in the Greek. Okay, so my translation. The generic or genetic law, nomos, now I mean of birth, right? Genikos. So the law of birth of the all, of the pan, of the all, capital A, is the first nous. And the second nous, mind, intellect, is that of the firstborn, the prototokos. And it is the chaos that spilleth forth, that floweth forth. Then there is the third soul, which worketh and took up the nomos, the law. And on account of this soul like is clothed with the form of an elephon. Now an elephon, an elephos, is a deer. Now there are other like possibilities. This could be a manuscript corruption, namely elafran, like the light form. Light as in you're not heavy. But I don't see the need to correct it to Elafran light. I think Elaphon is quite nice because there is a famed psalmic line that's at least very dear to me that is to the effect that I am like a deer in my or a doe in my longing for you, oh my God, and I go to the streams of cool water to refresh myself. So given that all their cosmology is about water, and we've had so many quotations about the living, jumping water, the deer quote is very fitting as an allusion in this poem by the Gnostic Naassenes, who are using the Psalter, no doubt, as inspiration. And so I think that's what it's alluding to, and there's no problem with the deer reference. And the reason some scholars feel the need to correct the manuscript and insert another word instead of deer is they don't know the Bible well enough to know that the deer in the water is a huge cosmological concept in Christianity. In fact, in one of the churches I used to attend, Byzantine churches in my city, there is a mural with deer drinking at the font of water that has this quote in ancient Greek extracted. That is quite cool. So that's why it came to mind when I was reading this. Anyway, just a bit as a personal anecdote, but I think it goes to show you one of my major arguments of why most philologists and antiquarians are lame in their studies of religion is when you don't actually have an ancient religion, you don't participate in it, and you don't live it, and you're not devoted to one. Truth be told, it sounds very elitist, but truth be told, if you're not doing those things, it's very unlikely you're going to be very good at understanding like the ancient literature because you're just realistically too far removed from it. Your behavior and perception is such that you won't properly engage with the text. Again, I mean, take that or leave it. You can see that as elitist, but when you really think about it, if you're like a secular atheist materialist, your opinion on like ancient religious literature is going to be pretty tainted, for lack of a better word, by your outlook, and it's going to be impeded. It's not going to be the same as a person who comes to it with the same kind of ethos and experience that the people who composed it and first performed it would have themselves had, and also unadulterated by, the fact that you use this language living as a living liturgical language. So maybe that's just me hyping myself, whatever, but I feel like it's got to be said. How can that not be mentioned? It's kind of the elephant in the room, really. And the question to me arises of like, why are you interested, ultimately, as a person who doesn't venerate these things? Why are you so interested in antiquarian studies? Like you're just studying some obsolete human faculty of the past that you think is boorish and doesn't play a role in your life. But what, you study it just for like the sake of posterity or preserving something that's boorish and antiquated. It's kind of silly. I think the point of preserving it and having interest in it is because you actually like value it. Maybe what I'm saying is divisive. Sorry for this interjection, but I don't know. I think about these things all the time, and I just don't really understand the people who devote so much time to this stuff but don't actually revere it. I just think that's really odd. Anyway, whatever. Returning to the text. So this returning. Well, I'll back up a bit so it makes sense. So on account of this, the soul like clothes herself with the form of a deer, and she toils hard um, in death by being like preoccupied, possessed of meletima, of like contemplation, study, and thought. Um, and she looks to the light, holding sometimes the kingdom, and she is cast down, crying sometimes towards mercy, and yet sometimes when she crieth, she rejoices. For sometimes when she crieth, she is judged or condemned. And when she is judged or condemned, she dies or perishes. And then there arises like a lack of uh, exit for this soul, which is like preoccupied with, you know, thoughts in evil. And she uh, is like lost and wandering about and comes into a labyrinth. And Jesus says, "Look, O Father, at this seeking of evils upon the earth," as the soul presumably wanders by your breath, your pnoe, your spirit. For she seeks to escape the bitter chaos, but does not know where she is going. And on account of this, send me, O Father, that I might go down katabatically, having the seals, the sacramental seals, so that I might pass through all of the ions, the eons, and that I might open up all the mysteries, and that I might show forth the forms of the gods. And so the hidden things of the holy path, of the holy way, I shall call gnosis, and I shall give it over to them. I shall reveal it. Right? So it's Christ coming down through the gates of heaven as the Logos, addressing his Father, saying, I have the special seals of Gnosis that I'm going to reveal to humanity to help the wandering lost soul that has come down from on high from the divine essence and is entrapped in the watery chaos below. Okay. And so that was the quote. And now we get the final closing of this chapter of the Refutation of All Heresies, wherein St. Hippolytus makes some closing remarks about the Naassenes and their relation to other Gnostic sects. And he likens this serpentine sect that is preoccupied with the Nachash, the Naas, the serpent. He likens them to the multi-headed Hydra of Greek myth that Heracles killed. So these things the Naassenes argue when they call themselves Gnostics. And since the multi-headed uh, deception is like has many schismata, like branches out into many um, branches, as is truly told in the histories of the Hydra, so too, according to this one, the heads must be struck in order for it to be rebuked. so that the rod of truth must be used by us so that every beast might be slain by us. We might kill every vile beast. So he's simply saying, like, this Naassene sect is spread out with many heads, just like the Hydra, and we as the Orthodox must use the rod of truth to chop up these heads and defeat the Hydra as Heracles did. What I think is most cool, though, is that this reference to the Heracles myth by an Orthodox Christian involves him saying, as was truthfully narrated in the history, hos alethos historumene, right? That is really fascinating because that goes to show that he, as an Orthodox thinker, combating these heretics and criticizing their appropriation of pagan mystagogic materials and so on and so on. Nonetheless, he like totally believes that Heracles killed the Hydra as a fact of history. So, I'm not alone in that respect, I suppose. I think that it's just very cool and just, subtly worked into the narrative there. Um, anyway, so returning to the text, we're almost done. Nor do the rest of the heresies differ much in their appearance from this one of the Naascenes, for they are all held together by the same um, spirit of deception. For since the words and the names of the snake are changed into many different heads of the snake, thus they wish to do, but nonetheless, we need to rebuke them as they will. So, yeah, he's simply concluding by stating that the other Gnostic groups basically aren't that different from the Naascenes, and they're just like subgroups that have split off and still nonetheless have the same core ideas. They just shift around names and details. And honestly, that's pretty accurate. Gnostics themselves and weirdo secular scholars are going to get all enraged and proclaim that no, the diversity is so significant. Like, true, there are different focuses. Some have an astrological focus, some have a numerical focus, some an anatomical focus. There is diversity, of course, but the core fact of the matter is that there's an underlying commonality of features, namely the belief that the material creation is pretty bad, the belief that the soul is entrapped in the body and needs to escape it, the denial of the physical resurrection, the denial of the enfleshed incarnation of the Logos Christ. They tend to be more docetic in their understanding of these things, and so on and so on. There are genuine features. And another feature, of course, is the intense indebtedness to the theology of the Greek mystery cults and the Greek polytheist philosophers and poets. Um, and of course, yes, Orthodox Christianity does embody some of that content, like Platonism and so on. And indeed, Greek monastics and Christian aristocrats over time preserved all the Greek classics in Byzantium. There's no doubt about that. And they've shaped the language and the thought of the Orthodox Church, sure, but it's not quite the same as the degree to which Gnosticism imports those ideas. And one of the major features of Gnosticism that we've looked at in our treatment here of the Naascenes is this focus on celibacy and resisting gestation and growth, right? The emphasis on non-reproductive sexual intercourse. All right, well, that's all for today, kings and queens, and I shall see you in the next installment.